The forest is awake. What time is it where you are? And from where do you listen? Subscribe and hear what hides in the dark. The following is a story that happened to me about 2 years ago. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now. I live in Oregon City, Oregon, a short drive south of Portland. I'm on the outskirts, somewhere between suburban and rural housing. I have neighbors, but they're not exactly next door. I was 19 at the time of this story. I used to have a problem with sleep. I don't know what it was, but I'd get mentally crippling anxiety, and I'd go for a walk to calm my mind. I live on a single-lane road that follows a stream through the woods, so the scenery, mixed with the quiet trickle of water, was always quite calming. It was summertime, and it was a particularly rough night for me. I remember telling my dad I was going for a walk as I slipped on my shoes and hurried out. I still recall the worried look on his face as I tried to escape my own mental panic. My late-night walks were becoming more frequent, and I knew it concerned him. Nevertheless, I shut the door behind me and proceeded into the dark. I remember it being a clear night, but I don't recall seeing stars. The moon must have been full, because I could see the road without a light. But I don't remember actually seeing the moon either. I just started walking, talking to myself about everything that had my anxiety spiked. I'm sure I looked insane rambling out loud, but it sometimes helped me process my issues. From my home to the main road is about a mile. I was about 2/3 of the way there when I heard something rustle in the bushes to my right. This wasn't uncommon. I'd encountered deer, raccoons, a bobcat, and even a few coyotes on my walks. Still, I liked to know what was around, so I pulled out my phone and switched on the light. For context, there's a hill to my right that slopes upward. That's where I heard the noise. To my left is about a 10-foot drop down to the creek. I shined my light into the bushes to see what I was dealing with. Usually, animals either freeze or run off, which helps me figure out what they are. But there was nothing, no movement at all. Suddenly my hair stood on end. I felt scared, tense, and realized I should have been able to hear the creek trickling over the rocks. But I couldn't. Something was clearly wrong. I heard a branch snap in the bushes again. I moved my light back and saw 2 small red lights, like eyes, looking right at me. I shifted my phone to see if it was a reflection, but it wasn't. Then it started to get closer. I ran. I freaking ran. I ran in near silence. I don't know if I screamed. Maybe it didn't matter. I couldn't hear my shoes hitting the road, my breathing, or even my heartbeat. All I heard was what sounded like an animal with human bare feet chasing me. Some primal survival instinct told me to find light. Something bigger than my phone's light. My first thought was home, where there's a large barn light out front that illuminates the whole driveway. I ran like hell was on my heels, because for all I knew it was. I just remember hearing it get closer. It felt like it was toying with me, because its footstep pattern didn't sound like an all-out sprint, more like a light gallop. It wasn't until I rounded the last corner and could see the light that it suddenly picked up speed and started closing in. I sprinted toward the light pole as fast as I could. I heard its furious steps come to an abrupt stop, but I didn't turn around. I practically tackled that tar-covered wooden post, clinging to it as I waited for the end, waiting for whatever it was to tear me apart. It never did. I stayed there for about an hour in silence until my phone rang. I had 3 messages and 2 missed calls, all from my dad asking where I was. I lied and said I fell asleep in a field up the road. Then I noticed I could hear the world around me again, so I assumed it was gone. I ran inside the house and locked the doors. To this day, I don't walk alone on my road, day or night. I know what you're probably thinking. It was just your mind playing tricks, or it was just an animal. But I've seen animals. I know what lives around here. Whatever this was, it's not something I've ever encountered before. This whole experience made me reflect on other strange incidents out here. Things I couldn't explain. A fully grown deer, burned from the inside out, for instance. The only visible clue was a single spot in its ribs where the flesh and bone had burned through. Yet the rest of it looked perfectly preserved. There have also been moments where I seemed to slip through time. I'd set my alarm for 6 a.m. and wait outside for my ride for 3 hours, only to come back inside and find it was still just turning 5 a.m. I've seen shadow figures by the side of the road. There have been a couple of unexplained deaths. The list goes on. I'm telling you, something strange and terrifying is out here. Some nights I wonder, do my doors and windows really keep whatever it is out, or is it still just toying with me? Edit. If anyone has any ideas what the hell I'm dealing with, please let me know. I got the invite on a quiet Thursday. My buddy Danny rang me up with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a hunting trip in northern BC, on land reserved exclusively for a local band and their guests. I'd only ever heard rumors about places like this, pristine wilderness, hardly touched by outsiders. So my answer was an immediate yes. Before I knew it, I was packing gear into my truck, double-checking every piece of equipment. Danny mentioned we'd be the only outsiders in the area, which gave the trip a weird sense of privilege and caution. There was an undercurrent of excitement as we headed out in a small convoy. Me, Danny, and a handful of others, including 2 band members who had arranged the permits. The drive itself felt endless. We barreled down narrow roads with barely any signs. Tree canopies thickened overhead, making it clear this was no typical tourist stop. Radio signal was non-existent, so we kept each other awake with jokes and half-baked legends about the deep north. Some funny, some dark. One story about the Highway of Tears hung in my mind longer than I'd have liked. It was just a passing mention, but it set the tone. By late afternoon, we reached the spot designated for our base camp, a small clearing near a winding stream. Unloading gear felt like it took hours. Tents went up, cooking gear rattled out of crates, and the band members walked us through a few ground rules. No wandering off alone, and always let someone know where you were headed. They said they keep track of everyone in the territory for safety reasons. It was comforting in theory, but it also made me wonder what might happen if someone unexpected showed up. That first night, we settled in around the fire, taking turns sharing our plans for the next few days. We'd split into pairs or trios to scout the area for moose or elk, then meet back in the evenings. I tried to soak in the calm atmosphere. Cool air, distant croaks of frogs in the water. Still, there was a lingering tension in the group. Maybe it was just me overthinking, but even Danny seemed more on edge than usual. Over the next few days we hiked deeper into the landscape. We followed game trails through brush, clambered over fallen logs, and paused whenever we heard branches snapping in the distance. Every so often, we'd find fresh tracks or droppings, but the animals stayed elusive. One evening we even joked that the wildlife knew we were outsiders, and decided to keep their distance. On the 4th day, though, things took a strange turn. While trudging along a narrow path, I noticed footprints in the mud that didn't match any of ours. Too small. Maybe a different tread. A few yards away, we found a discarded food wrapper, partially buried in dirt. It could have been anyone's trash, but the band members exchanged uneasy glances. They insisted no one else was registered to be out here. It left me with an unsettled feeling, like we weren't entirely alone. I tried to shrug it off, focusing on the hunt, but it stayed in the back of my mind. When we returned to base camp that evening, the others reported similar findings. Footprints, bits of random debris, even a faint trail of footprints heading north. We decided to remain vigilant. No one said it out loud, but we all knew something was off. The land was massive, sure, but folks around here didn't just wander in without telling the band. It felt like we were tiptoeing on someone else's turf, and that unnamed someone didn't want to be found. By the end of that day, the mood around our fire was noticeably tense. We tried to keep spirits up with stories and a hearty meal, but the conversation kept drifting toward the possibility that strangers were lurking out there. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, call it paranoia. Another part couldn't ignore the quiet in the air that felt loaded with secrets. I told myself we'd have a fresh start come morning, that maybe we'd figure it out or forget about it once we bagged some game. But deep down, I sensed that the real story was just getting started, and we were heading straight into it. It happened the morning we pushed further than usual. Our group was heading toward a new patch of land rumored to have plenty of game, but I had a strange apprehension that kept creeping in. The band members seemed just as wary. They kept trading anxious looks, and I could tell they wanted us all to stick closer together. We navigated dense brush for hours. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the forest around us felt damp and heavy. Occasionally, we spotted odd footprints leading off the trail, smaller than what we'd expect from a hunter wearing standard boots. No one said much about them, but we all silently acknowledged this was unusual. Eventually, Danny, who was leading, motioned for us to slow down. Through the thick undergrowth, we spotted a clearing. It wasn't big, but I caught glimpses of something that looked like tents. We carefully crept forward, expecting to bump into another hunting party. Instead, we entered a bizarre makeshift campsite. 2 tents were sloppily pitched side by side. Several garbage bags were haphazardly scattered around, and a couple more were leaning against a fallen tree trunk. A ring of stones formed what might have been a fire pit, the ash still fresh. It felt like the occupants had stepped out only moments ago. Yet the entire place was silent, not even a rustle. We tried calling out, thinking we'd find folks who were simply off collecting firewood or scouting. Nobody answered. Danny took a few steps into the camp while the rest of us hung back, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing but the rustle of leaves in the breeze. One of the band members, Noah, decided to check the tents. He peeked inside, hoping to find an ID. He quickly pulled back with a grimace. A couple of sleeping bags were tossed about, no personal papers in sight, just a lingering odor like stale sweat. Across the campsite, another hunter named Brian poked a hole in one of the garbage bags, searching for receipts or something that could point to who was out here. He paused, eyes wide, and waved us over. We gathered around as he pulled out a small piece of clothing, bright pink, frilly, and obviously not something a typical hunter would wear. Then, he reached deeper and drew out a handful of women's clothes, all jammed in together. We stared, trying to process why anyone would stash so many garments in the middle of nowhere. The confusion deepened when Brian unfolded a shirt with rusty brown splotches along the sleeves. It was impossible to pretend we didn't recognize what that might be. The sight made my stomach lurch. We stood there, surrounded by half a dozen bags stuffed full of clothes, some of which had what looked like old bloodstains. There were even purses mixed in. Several, all different styles, some with straps torn off. An icy wave of realization swept through our group. This wasn't an innocent case of campers forgetting their laundry. Something much darker was hidden here. My pulse hammered, and I felt the urge to leave right then. We were in way over our heads. We had no idea if the owners of this place would come back, or whether they were already watching from the trees. Noah took charge, telling everyone to stop rummaging, so we wouldn't mess up any potential evidence. We huddled in the middle of the camp, glancing at the thick woods around us. Every snapped twig, every gust of wind felt menacing. At one point, someone murmured about hearing footsteps in the distance, but we never saw anything. It only took a few minutes of whispered deliberation before we decided to pack up and leave. A direct route back to the road was our best chance. That meant hours of fast hiking through rugged terrain, but none of us wanted to stay in that campsite a second longer. We hurried back the way we came, darting through bushes and stumbling over roots. A couple of times, I thought I heard branches moving behind us, like someone, or something, was following. It was impossible to be sure in that tangled forest. By the time we reached the first gravel road, it felt like 1,000 pounds had lifted off my chest. We flagged down a passing truck and piled in, breathless and shaken. The driver looked bewildered at our story, but he drove us to the nearest small town in silence, eyes flicking back at us in the rearview mirror, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe any of it. The local police station was modest, a single building with a few cars parked out front. We practically burst inside, trying to explain ourselves while still trying to catch our breath. The officers were taken aback at our account of a hidden camp, women's clothing stuffed in garbage bags and possible bloodstains. They asked us to point it out on a map and took down every detail we could remember. A search party was organized, but it took close to 2 days for them to get out there and locate the site. And once they arrived, it was gone, completely cleared out. The tents, the garbage bags, even the fire pit stones were removed, leaving only faint depressions in the dirt. Whatever had been there had vanished, as if it never existed. We lingered in town expecting updates, but the authorities had no real leads for us. No official statements ever popped up in the local news. It was a dead end. Whenever I asked one of the cops about it, they just shake their heads and say they were working on it, though they never reached out afterward. Back at our own homes, we tried to piece together a theory. Someone remembered the talk about the Highway of Tears, dozens of missing women, rumors of organized predators lurking in remote corners. The clothes we found might have been connected to something unspeakable. That possibility stuck with me long after I'd washed the forest dirt off my boots. Knowing we'd stumbled across evidence of real darkness out there, on land that once felt so peaceful, unsettled me in ways I can't fully explain. We'd gone in search of game and a good time. Instead, we discovered a piece of a nightmare that seemed to slip through our fingers when we tried to bring it to light. To this day, I still picture that camp whenever I close my eyes. Abandoned tents, random trash, and piles of clothes nobody should have found in a place like that. We never got answers. But every so often, I think about what might have happened if we'd arrived earlier, or if we'd stuck around too long. It's a thought that keeps me awake more nights than I'd like to admit. I've been roaming these farm roads for as long as I can remember. Growing up out here meant not much else to do besides hunting squirrels, fishing in creek beds, and helping neighbors when they needed extra muscle. It was a decent trade-off. They'd let me tread their land in search of game, and I'd fix a fence or corral a stray cow whenever asked. It was a routine that suited me just fine, until I learned about that old house tucked deep in a forgotten valley. From the outside, it was unlike any rundown shack I'd seen before. Despite the rusted tin roof, the place still seemed solid. 2 stories of finely crafted wood, with every window intact. You could tell it must have cost a fortune back when it was built. Out back stood a half-collapsed building that everyone whispered about. They called it the Slave Shack, and nobody wanted to talk about its history. Even the farmer who owned the land clammed up if you pressed him on it. He had one big rule for me. I could hunt the surrounding woods all I wanted, but I was never to set foot inside that house. He told me he stored equipment there and worried I'd hurt myself on rotting boards or rusted nails. On the surface it made sense. I respected him enough to keep my distance most days. But something about that silent structure made it impossible to ignore. Once or twice, I slipped inside just for a peek, quick and quiet, mostly to confirm the floors were still rock solid. The farmer never found out, and I never told a soul. Nights out there brought the strangest sights. My stepdad and I used to hunt raccoons in the fields near the house. We'd switch off our flashlights to preserve our night vision, crouching in the tall grass, and waiting. Sometimes we'd notice a faint glow drifting across the upstairs windows. It looked exactly like a single candle moving from room to room, too steady to be moonlight reflecting off glass. That valley was nowhere near any roads, and we were the only ones around with flashlights, which we kept off. It made no sense. My stepdad would side-eye me as if to say, "Don't ask," and I'd just stare at those windows, too anxious to blink. My biggest turning point came on a day that started out mild. I was out searching for red fox squirrels under the big oaks near the house. The sky seemed clear, barely any breeze. Then, without warning, the wind kicked up and the temperature plummeted. I'm not talking about a mild chill. You know the kind that digs right under your skin? My thin jacket wasn't cutting it. Every gust felt like it was slicing right through me, and I realized I was a couple miles from home, with zero shelter in sight. I had no choice but to use the one place off limits. Stepping onto the porch, I hesitated. The farmer's warning rang in my mind, but my numb fingers gripped the doorknob anyway. The wind howled behind me, ready to rip the breath from my lungs if I stayed out another minute. So I pushed that old door open and slipped into a hallway of dim light. Instantly, the biting cold faded. leaving me in this weird hush. My cheeks stung as blood started flowing again, and it felt more comforting than I ever expected. I remember thinking, this can't be real, because the shift was so abrupt. It was almost like crossing into a different world. I took a moment to scan my surroundings. The farmer's equipment, wire cutters, fence posts, a couple of large toolboxes, was lined up against the walls. Dust drifted across the floor in the faint glow that seeped in through the windows. The craftsmanship was impressive, especially for a house this old. Smooth wood paneling, a sturdy staircase, and tall ceilings that made it feel more mansion than farmhouse. Despite the grime, it had a calm grace about it, but there was something else too. A tingling sense in the back of my mind, urging me to be cautious. I told myself it was just the rush of stepping into a forbidden spot, the fear of getting caught. Yet part of me suspected there might be another reason the farmer insisted nobody come here. I felt like I was trespassing on more than just private property. My rifle still hung over my shoulder, but I was more focused on the silence, broken only by the muffled wail of wind outside. As I stepped farther in, each footstep seemed to echo, as if the house itself was listening. My eyes drifted to a door at the end of the hallway, leading to who knows where. A swirl of dust flashed in the light as I moved, and my heart thudded in my chest. I had never been this deep inside, not with the intention of wandering. I stood there, telling myself I just needed to warm up and go. But after a moment, curiosity started to claw at me, hinting that maybe I should explore just a little more. The house was silent, waiting. Still, a small voice in my head insisted that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. I tried to push that aside, thinking, what could possibly be hiding in a place like this? Outside, the wind pounded against the old walls. Inside, I felt a heaviness I couldn't name. My fingers hovered over the door handle at the end of the hall, uncertain whether I'd open it or keep my promise. The glow I'd seen at night flickered through my thoughts. I couldn't explain what was more unsettling, the notion I was alone in that house, or the idea that maybe I wasn't. I rested my hand on the knob, feeling the cold metal under my skin. For a second, I almost imagined I heard movement somewhere beyond that door, just a soft shuffle, like someone shifting their weight. It could have been the building settling, or maybe the wind found a gap in the boards. I didn't know what to believe. All I did know was that I was on the edge of something I might regret. And that moment, that fleeting second of indecision, was all it took for me to realize there was no turning back. I stood in that dim hallway, lingering by a battered door whose edges were chipped from years of neglect. The old house had been dead silent moments ago, but now it seemed to breathe in unison with me. That door in front of me was slightly ajar, as though inviting me to cross a final boundary. In the hush, the wind outside sounded remote, like a distant chorus. My mind was torn between heading back into the cold, or surrendering to the pull of something sinister. I nudged the door open and peered down a flight of creaking stairs. They led into an inky darkness that made every instinct of mine scream to turn away. The only reason I kept going was because that tiny voice of pride in my head refused to admit I was afraid. With a trembling flashlight in hand and my shotgun balanced on my shoulder, I inched down step by step. Each board groaned under my boots, and the stale air hit my nose, a mix of damp earth and rot. A warning that whatever lurked below wasn't meant for casual eyes. Halfway down, the warm sensation I'd felt upstairs vanished. It was like entering a different world, one that felt charged. It was difficult to pinpoint if the source was just my nerves or something deeper. The flashlight flickered, casting shaky beams along the walls. Spiderwebs swayed like veils, hinting that nobody had stepped foot here in ages. Yet I couldn't push aside the suspicion that I wasn't alone. Below me, the basement opened up into a cramped space. The walls were rough stone, with dusty shelves lining the perimeter. From what I could see, they were mostly empty, aside from a few rusted cans and glass jars, so clouded I couldn't see what they once held. I swept the flashlight around, trying to get my bearings. Each time the beam revealed a new corner, I half expected to catch sight of a shape crouched in the shadows. That was when the flashlight landed on something that made my insides twist. At the far wall, large iron chains were fastened directly into the stone. They ended in a set of equally rusted shackles. The metal looked ancient, weathered by more years than I could guess. I moved closer, though part of me didn't want to. The presence of those chains told a story nobody ever spoke about. A grim reminder that this wasn't just some old house. It was a place that might have swallowed entire lives. As I approached, an icy dread seeped through my gut. Dust coated the chains, but they still bore faint scratches, as though someone, or something, had struggled against them. My breathing hitched as I extended a hand. My flashlight's beam wavered as I tapped the shackles with my fingertips. They made a dull clang that echoed too loudly in that silent room. It was enough to make my teeth clench. Suddenly, a thunderous crash reverberated from above. It felt like the ceiling was about to cave in, sending a flurry of dust raining down. I jolted back, nearly losing my grip on the flashlight. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and I stood there, waiting for another crash or a shout or anything to explain the noise. Nothing followed. Just stillness, so complete it felt accusatory, like the house had caught me snooping in the most forbidden place. My common sense kicked in, telling me I needed to leave, now. I spun around and clambered toward the stairs, my feet tangling in my own haste. Each step rattled as though the staircase might buckle under me, but I didn't care. I had to escape that suffocating space where every second felt like an hour. When I reached the top, I shoved the door closed behind me and found myself back in the hallway, gulping in breaths of slightly fresher air. Yet something felt different now. The gentle warmth I experienced earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy atmosphere that pressed down on my shoulders. The silence was still there, but it carried weight, almost like a scolding presence. I lifted my gaze to the windows. The wind outside had dropped to a nervous hush, as if nature itself had paused to see what I'd do next. Gripping my shotgun, I hurried to the front door, refusing to look back down the hall. Deep down, part of me wanted to run back home and forget this entire adventure. Another part wanted to tear through every room until I uncovered every last secret. But there was no way I was staying, not after glimpsing those iron chains and hearing that door slam overhead in perfect menacing timing. Stepping onto the porch, I felt the cold sting my face once more, but it was a relief compared to the basement's choking air. I moved swiftly across the overgrown yard, not bothering to close the front door behind me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the yawning darkness of the entrance, daring me to come back. It was a silent promise that whatever I'd stumbled on was only a fraction of the story. As I put distance between me and that looming structure, questions flooded my mind. Who had those chains bound? Why were they so deeply anchored in a place that still radiated unease? Did the farmer know more than he let on? No matter how many times I looked back, the house remained still and inscrutable, as though it held 1,000 stories in its rotted bones, waiting for an unlucky soul to peel back the layers. By the time I rounded the edge of the property, my breath steadied, but the gnawing unease stayed. The ordeal left me rattled, unsure if I would ever see the house in the same light again, or if I even wanted to. One thing was certain: the deeper I ventured into that place, the more it felt like it had a heartbeat of its own, and it wasn't one to be trifled with. I left the house while the sky still hovered in that half-light of early morning, hoping to catch sight of some wildlife before the day got too warm. My 2 dogs, Duke and Jax, trotted out of the truck and onto the trail, usually raring to go. But right from the start, something was off. The entire place was so quiet, it was practically humming with tension. No distant birds calling, not even a stray cricket. I'm used to the woods brimming with noise, squirrels scurrying in the underbrush, a crow cawing overhead, maybe the soft crunch of leaves as a deer scampers away. That morning, though, there was nothing but a heaviness in the air. I remember glancing at the dogs, expecting them to nose around like they usually do, tails wagging like they were auditioning for a dog food commercial. Instead, both stayed close to my ankles. Jax even paused to stare into the tree line as if he expected something to burst out at any second. I tried to push aside the uneasy sense in my gut by focusing on the task at hand. I was here to hunt, or at least to see what was moving around. So I ventured farther along, scanning the ground for tracks. Oddly enough, I barely saw any sign of recent animal activity. No deer prints, no coyote scat. Nothing to suggest a living creature had crossed this path in a while. Usually the dogs would sniff out a hint of something and tug me in a new direction, but they had nothing to report. After a couple of hours picking my way through undergrowth without a single sign of game, I veered back toward a small creek we'd passed. If the forest had decided to clam up, maybe the water would offer better luck. Fishing's always been my fallback. It's just me, a line, and the calm reflection of sky on the water. The quiet still held though, like even the wind was too scared to rustle the leaves. Casting a line into the creek felt like dropping a pin in a silent auditorium. Duke and Jack settled on the bank, both gazing at me with a kind of muted confusion, as if they couldn't figure out why there wasn't a single bird overhead. I shrugged it off, figured maybe the weather patterns had shifted, or something had spooked the wildlife earlier. Still, I couldn't deny that it put me on edge. That said, it didn't take long before I felt a tug on the line, which was almost a relief. Maybe all I needed was a nice catch to remind me that nature sometimes just has off days. The fish gave a decent fight, but within a few minutes I had it flopping in the shallows. It was odd how quickly it had gone for the lure, but I wasn't about to complain. At least it was something. I hoisted it up, letting the sunlight glint off its scales. For a moment, it was almost normal. Just a fisherman and his catch. The dogs perked up too, like maybe we'd finally shaken off whatever strangeness hung over the morning. But even as I held the fish, the hush in the surrounding trees refused to break. No splashing of frogs, no insects buzzing near the water. It felt like everything with a heartbeat had abandoned the area, leaving me and the dogs to puzzle over the sudden emptiness. If I'd been smarter, maybe I would have called it quits right then, tossed the fish back, and headed straight home. But I'm a stubborn old soul, and I'd come out here to enjoy the day, silence or no silence, so that's exactly what I planned to do. At least that was my thinking at the time. Little did I know, the most unsettling discovery still lay ahead. All I knew in that moment was that it was only mid-morning, and already I was counting the hours until I could climb back into my truck and be done with this unnerving quiet. The idea of pressing on felt wrong, but I chalked it up to superstition and kept going. Sometimes, I wish I'd listened to my instincts right then and there. Instead, I trudged along with that fish in hand, dogs padding after me, unaware of how badly the day was about to unravel. I set up a small fire by the creek, figuring a fresh-caught fish would make a decent breakfast. My dogs flanked me, both more restless than usual. As I started the routine, gathering kindling, getting a little flame going, Duke and Jax kept peering into the trees like they expected a bear to come barreling out at any second. Still, not a single branch rustled, no birds flitted overhead. That hush felt so absolute, it gave the impression we were intruders in a place that wasn't ours to inhabit. Anyway, I was hungry and tired of the eerie stillness, so I focused on frying up that fish. Once the fire caught, I tossed a bit of Crisco into my pan, and bent down to gut the catch. Normally, I'd mutter something about how it's the messy part of the process, but instead, I went quiet the moment the knife cut through the belly. Right away, I could see this mass of long dark parasites squirming inside. They twisted and coiled so thickly, the fish's flesh looked more worm than meat. It was nauseating, like opening a rotten log and finding it crawling with insects, only worse because I was holding it in my hands. Duke let out a low whine. For a moment, I just stared, debating whether to throw the whole thing into the creek. But that seemed like I'd be contaminating the water, so I chucked it onto the fire instead. The parasites sizzled and hissed in the flames, giving off a smell so revolting it turned my stomach. It wasn't just the usual stink of cooking fish. It was a foul chemical reek that clung to my clothes. I backed away, splashing creek water on my hands until they felt numb from the cold. That was the moment I decided these woods needed a heads up. The rangers might want to check the water supply or run a test on the fish population. So I kicked dirt onto the fire, planning to head back to my truck and make a stop at the ranger station on my way out. My dogs seemed relieved, bounding a few steps ahead like they were happy to leave this spot behind. Usually I'd be disappointed cutting a trip short, but I couldn't ignore the sense that something was deeply wrong. On the walk back, the forest only got stranger. No chirping birds, no movement in the trees. I passed by spots where I'd sometimes see deer or foxes, but the undergrowth looked untouched, as if nothing had even brushed by. The quiet was so total that every step I took on the leaf-covered ground echoed in my own ears. It felt like the woods had died, yet the leaves and grass looked perfectly alive. That's when a thin haze started drifting through the air. I'm not talking about morning fog or leftover smoke from my fire. It was more like a faint, lingering vapor that smelled sour, almost acidic, as though something was rotting in a chemical spill. The dogs coughed and snorted, clearly not fans of the odor. I kept glancing around to see if we'd maybe crossed paths with a decaying carcass, but there was no sign of anything dead, just more silence and that creeping haze. As I pressed on, I couldn't shake the growing urgency clawing at my mind. Every minute I stayed in that environment felt like a risk. The world felt wrong, and it wasn't just about that fish anymore. I started imagining an entire water system contaminated with those wriggling parasites. Or maybe a bigger issue that had driven all the animals out. I had my rifle over my shoulder, but for once it didn't make me feel any safer. How do you defend yourself against something invisible? Something that infects fish so thoroughly, it's like the creature never stood a chance. My plan was simple. Get back to the truck, get on the road, report this to the rangers. The dogs seemed to understand the plan too, because they kept shooting me these anxious looks, staying close by my side instead of roaming ahead. I took that as confirmation enough. We needed out. Every so often, I paused to listen for any sign of life. An owl, a squirrel, a rustle in the brush, but the silence remained absolute, like a blanket smothering any normal sound. I'd had run-ins with danger before. Standoffs with territorial bears, accidental brushes with folks guarding illegal grow sites. Those situations were alarming, but they were threats I knew how to handle. You can stand your ground with a bear, fire a warning shot, or talk your way out with some anxious-looking people who'd rather be left alone. But this felt like stepping into a nightmare. Maybe it was a freak natural occurrence, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, I wasn't about to hang around and find out. As the truck came to mind, I quickened my pace. My one regret was tossing that fish on the fire. Part of me wished I'd found a way to bag the corpse and show a ranger. But I wasn't about to go digging through the ashes for that infected mess, not with the dogs as rattled as they were. Jax actually kept bumping his nose into the back of my knee every few steps, as if to say, "We need to move faster." And for once, I didn't argue with him. The deeper I walked, the more obvious it became. The forest had emptied out for a reason, and I was outstaying my welcome. I just hoped I could leave before discovering what that reason might be. The sour haze, the infested fish, the oppressive silence. It felt like signs pointing me in one direction, out. And that's exactly where I was headed, determined to get back to my truck, and away from whatever had tainted this place so completely. I was more than halfway back to my truck when Jack started barking in this wild, frenzied way I'd never heard before. Duke joined in a second later, both hackles raised and eyes wide with alarm. They were facing the same stretch of woods we'd just come through, dense undergrowth, twisted branches, and complete stillness. It was as if they sensed something moving where I could only see shadows. I gripped my rifle, scanning the area. Normally I'd catch a rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig if there was a bear or another big predator. Instead, absolute silence. My gut told me something was watching from the trees, something that didn't want to be seen. Jack's back toward me, tail tucked. He never cowered like that. Not even when we'd crossed paths with a grizzly. That's what made me realize we couldn't just stand there waiting for whatever lurked beyond those bushes. I started urging the dogs forward, picking up my pace. Each step felt like wading through molasses. There was this overwhelming sense of pressure, like the forest itself was closing in. The air changed too, bringing an intense, acrid odor that made my nose sting. The stench reminded me of cat urine, only mixed with something rotten. Every breath tasted foul, as if we were inhaling some toxic vapor. I tried to push it out of my head, focusing on just getting us to the truck. We hurried along, the dogs darting ahead, then spinning around to check on me. Occasionally, Duke would pause to growl at the brush, but still, nothing moved. My heart hammered harder with each stretch of trail. For a few minutes I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, spooked by quiet woods and a rotten smell. But the terror in my dog's eyes was impossible to ignore. They sensed a threat, and they wanted out. So did I. When the path finally opened up into the clearing where I'd parked, relief slammed into me like a wave. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being pursued, possibly from a distance. I fumbled with my keys, the dogs whining and pawing at the door. The instant I got it open, they practically launched themselves inside. I yanked the door shut, turned the ignition, and gunned the engine. Gravel spit out behind my tires as I lurched onto the dirt road. Speeding away, I forced myself not to glance in the rearview mirror. Deep down, I was afraid I might spot a shape standing among the trees, something that shouldn't exist in any forest I'd known. My clothes clung to me, damp from sweat and that stomach-turning odor. Part of me wanted to believe we'd escaped whatever was out there, but a knot of dread stuck with me. The forest felt alive with a wrongness, and it had been closing in the entire time. I drove home in a daze, dogs curled up in the back seat, both panting hard. Usually the warmth of a truck ride calms them right down. That day, even safe behind locked doors, they kept their ears perked and eyes fixed on the passing trees. I had the same thought burning a hole in my mind. If something could silence an entire forest, infect its fish, and terrify two seasoned hunting hounds, how was I ever supposed to face it, or warn people before it got worse? I may have left that place behind for the moment, but I knew I hadn't truly escaped it at all. I had quite the experience when I was 17. I am now 26, but the events that unfolded remain forever burned into my memory, as if they happened yesterday. My father and I had decided to make a weekend hunting trip to my family's hunting cabin. The cabin is located on a 120-acre plot of land in the middle of Mark Twain National Forest. We loaded up on Friday morning and made the drive out to the cabin. It is extremely isolated. The closest house is roughly 10 miles away. The cabin sits in a clearing and is surrounded by fairly dense forest on all sides. We arrived around noon, brought everything inside, gassed up the electric generator, hooked it up, and then decided it would be a good time to figure out where we wanted to set up our deer blind and the stand we had brought along. I decided to go find a good spot for the blind, and my dad went to set up the stand in a different area of the woods. I followed a small game trail for quite a while, and eventually found a good spot. I spent some time setting up the blind and securing it so it would be ready to go first thing in the morning. As I was finishing up, I became very aware that something was watching me from the tree line about 25 yards away. At first, it was just that uneasy feeling, hairs on the back of my neck standing up, catching glimpses of movement. I saw something peek out from behind a tree and then duck back. Then I heard a loud crashing sound as it ran off in the opposite direction. It freaked me out at first, but since I didn't get a good look, I eventually convinced myself it was a deer or some other wild animal. I returned to the cabin and told my dad what had happened, and we both laughed about it. We made some dinner, bullcrapped a little, and settled down to sleep at about 9 p.m. Around 1:30 a.m., we both awoke to a loud crashing sound, like someone had thrown a large rock onto the roof. We got up, listened for a few minutes, and heard nothing but the eerie stillness of the night, occasionally interrupted by the howl of the wind outside. After a few minutes, we armed ourselves, and my dad grabbed a spotlight. We walked outside and shined it around but saw nothing. We eventually shrugged it off as a tree branch or something similar and went back to sleep. We got up around 5 a.m., I went to the deer blind, and my dad went to the stand he had set up. I stayed until around 8 a.m. without any incident. That evening, I decided I would go to the deer stand, and my father wanted to try the blind. We explained to each other where we had set up and headed off. My dad had placed the stand on the edge of a small field next to a stream, about a 20-minute walk away. I opted to leave the four-wheeler so I wouldn't scare any potential game in the area. I eventually found the stand, climbed up, and settled in. I had been sitting for a while, and hadn't seen anything other than a few rabbits and a lot of squirrels. The sun was starting to set, and I was about ready to head back to the cabin before dark. The sun was low enough that the woods were semi-dark and eerie, creating odd silhouettes at the edge of the shadows. As I was contemplating climbing down, I heard a rustle coming from the brush to my right. I looked over, hoping for a big buck, but immediately froze in fear. No more than 25 feet away stood a huge, upright creature, covered in reddish-brown hair, staring right at me. Its face looked so human, but it was definitely not human. It gave off an odor like old coffee grounds or garbage. It was roughly 7 feet tall or more, huge and massive. I can't emphasize enough how large this thing was. It could have ripped me to shreds without breaking a sweat. The deer stand was about 9 feet up, and it could have walked right over and yanked me out of it. I was terrified. It turned and walked off into some thick brush, and I lost sight of it. I took my chance, hopped out of the stand, and hurried back toward the cabin. I was completely freaked out and scared to death. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my head. I started to calm down a bit, thinking it had gone off in another direction, when I heard a limb break not too far behind me, off the path in the brush at the edge of the shadows. Then I heard more rustling. It was following me. I started to run, and I could hear it keeping pace with me, just out of sight in the darkness of the woods. I was really regretting not bringing the four-wheeler. I heard it getting closer and, panicked, I made a decision I immediately regretted. I turned and fired a shot in the direction of the noise, hoping to scare it off. It started screaming, loudly, unlike anything I had ever heard. It made my heart skip 10 beats. I just turned and sprinted as fast as I could. It kept screaming, sounding like it was knocking down trees as it came after me. I heard it come out, cross the trail, and then go into the woods on the other side, still gaining on me, screaming and wailing horribly the whole time. I never looked back, but it sounded so close I was sure it could grab me at any moment. Then I heard the sound of the four-wheeler. I kept running while this thing was behind me, screaming and wailing the most awful noise, bashing through the woods. I was still in a full sprint, and I could hear the four-wheeler in top gear heading my way. Just as I was certain this thing would catch me, my dad appeared on the four-wheeler, looking just as freaked out as I was. I jumped on, and he hauled back to the cabin. The entire time, I could still hear it screaming behind us. I didn't look back. By the time we reached the cabin, the screaming had stopped. We quickly gathered our things, decided to leave the stand and blind, and got out of there. On the way home, my dad told me that as he was approaching on the trail, he saw the creature maybe 20 paces behind me, chasing me. When it saw him on the four-wheeler, it ducked into the tree line. I believe if my dad hadn't shown up, I wouldn't be here typing this story. We talked about it a little on the drive home, and then we never spoke of it again. This is the first time since then that I've spoken of it to anyone. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. I can still hear it wailing and screaming, and it sends shivers down my spine. I haven't been in the woods much at all since then and have never once gone back to that cabin. After hearing all the stories on here, I wanted to write down my own experience that still freaks me out whenever I think about it. Just down the road from where I used to live a few years ago in Southeast Australia, there's an opening that leads into about 100 acres of woodlands and bush. I frequently went there when I was younger to ride, camp, and do the usual outdoorsy things. One night, around 11:30 p.m., I was out driving with my girlfriend. Since we were in the area, I decided to show her the woodlands. She loves everything related to nature, and because it was summer, the night was extremely warm. I parked my car so the headlights were shining into the trees, as we weren't planning to go very far and it was pitch black inside. We both sat there chatting, having a smoke, and generally relaxing. She was sitting on a sort of plastic-covered map of the area, and I kept watching the trees because I had a strong feeling that something wasn't right. I've read posts where people mentioned feeling like they were in danger, even though nothing around them seemed out of place, and I had that exact same feeling. Every sense was on high alert and my adrenaline was up, yet I couldn't see anything unusual in front of me. After lighting another cigarette to calm my nerves, I scanned the tree line again, and realized it looked different than before. It took a moment of staring into the dark to notice that moonlight was now hitting some grass where there had previously been a black shape blocking the light. A shape I had assumed was just a tree. I get goosebumps just typing this, but the only way to describe the next moment is that all sound suddenly ceased, leaving everything dead silent. A few seconds later, a horrible feeling of dread washed over me. I saw something move in the dark along the path. It was crawling toward us on all fours. I've seen nearly every animal in the outback, and we don't have large predators like they do in the US or Europe, but I somehow knew this thing was a predator. It wasn't hiding. It was deliberately crawling toward us. I don't know if my girlfriend saw it at first because I couldn't look away. As soon as it reached the edge of the car's headlights, it rose up onto two legs and just stared at us. I'm 6'4", and this thing was about a meter taller than me, with arms far too long, almost reaching the ground. Its fur looked off-white, almost yellowish, and in the dim light, its head resembled that of a dog or a wolf. I couldn't move while it stared at me, but then my girlfriend gasped, snapping me out of whatever was preventing me from thinking straight. I grabbed her arm, sprinted to the car, slammed the doors, and sped away as fast as I could. We were both too terrified to speak until a good half-hour later. We've discussed it many times since then. The feeling we had was like what I imagine a rabbit feels when it sees a wolf or fox watching it. The realization that this creature could end us with absolute ease if it chose to. Neither of us has been able to explain what we saw, but it definitely changed how I view the woods and bush. Now, whenever I go camping or hiking, I think back to that night and wonder what it was, and if I'll ever see something like it again. This is a true encounter, and one of the creepier experiences I've had, and trust me, I've had plenty. I stumbled across this sub recently, so I thought I'd share my story here, and see if anyone has had similar experiences anywhere in the US. Back in the summer of 2017, my girlfriend and I were driving up from Evanston, Illinois, to spend the weekend at her parents' lakefront cottage in Petoskey, Michigan, a popular destination for summer retreats. The drive was about 6 hours, taking us north through the western half of Michigan. Much of this route goes through fairly remote areas. Eventually we realized we'd been on the same single-lane highway through dense woods for what felt like at least 45 minutes. I remember our navigation showing we were somewhere in the Huron-Manistee National Forests. When I say dense, I mean the tree canopy formed a tunnel over the narrow road, making it seem significantly darker than it actually was outside. Luckily, Michigan summer days are long, and we still had a couple of hours of daylight left. While driving, I noticed some older, dilapidated structures in the woods on the right. Looked like remains of old sheds or storage buildings. This is a good time to mention that I'm a bit of a treasure hunter. I collect historical relics and old coins. These ruins seemed like a great place to dig up artifacts that might have been buried for years. Also, this stretch of road was deserted, so it was unlikely anyone else had explored the site recently. Luckily, I had my metal detector in the car. I planned to use it on the beach at Petoskey. I also had a child shovel, one of those with a neon plastic scoop and a wooden handle, for digging in sand. It wasn't ideal for soil, but I figured it would do. I told my girlfriend I wanted to stop for a bit and pulled over onto the shoulder. She said okay, but preferred to stay in the car and continue napping. The closest ruins were small, and not too far from the road, but I noticed a larger structure deeper in the forest and decided to check it out because bigger buildings, homes, etc., tend to yield cooler finds. When I got closer, I saw it was made of brick. The window openings were still clearly defined, with dirty broken glass around the edges. Peering through one window, I could see that although half of the building had collapsed, part of the floor was still intact. I could just barely see my car from there. Because it was so dark around the ruins, I left my shovel outside. I wouldn't need it on the building's hard floor, and used my free hand to hold up my phone as a flashlight to spot anything metallic. I snooped around one corner and swept the metal detector around the interior. The roof was collapsed for about half an hour. Then I started hearing movement around me, crunching twigs and rustling bushes. At first, I dismissed it as small animals, but it continued, almost as though it was following my movements around the building's perimeter. At that point, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I got the distinct feeling I was being watched, like some animal was stalking me. I decided to turn back. I shouted and made loud noises in hopes of scaring off whatever was there, then cautiously headed to where I'd left my shovel. It was gone. I was certain I hadn't misplaced it. Being neon orange, it would have been impossible to miss if it were still there in the open. That was enough to spook me. I said screw it, and booked it back to my car. When I jumped into the driver's seat, I saw my girlfriend was awake and looked alarmed. She told me that just a few minutes earlier, she'd seen a child emerge from the forest and stare at her from several feet down the road. She described him as a boy of maybe 7 or 8, with a dirty face and ragged clothes. She said she was worried the boy might be lost, but the way he looked at her made her uneasy. She mentioned he didn't seem scared or curious, but just stared with a gaze that seemed off for a lost child. She also said she wanted to notify the police, but wasn't comfortable leaving the car or calling out to the kid, who had disappeared by then. I hadn't yet told her about what happened by the ruins, but my heart started pounding. While I was looking up the non-emergency number for the nearest sheriff's office on my phone, my girlfriend suddenly screamed my name. I looked up to see a boy, similar to the one she described, standing at the edge of the woods, just a few feet from the passenger door, staring directly at us. Then I noticed another boy, identical in appearance, right outside the back window, peering into the back seat. That was it for me. I turned on the car and floored it out of there. After driving for a few seconds, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the boys disappear into the forest as quickly as they'd appeared. I sped for who knows how long until we were well clear of those woods. We ended up calling the sheriff's office, and they mentioned there had been similar sightings of children along that stretch of road by other drivers. Though I never got a very good look, I agreed with my girlfriend that something was off about those kids. Their behavior didn't match that of normal lost children. Maybe they lived on a secluded property and were just playing in the woods, or trying to steal our stuff. I've heard of feral children, which might explain their dirty faces and ragged clothes. Later, at the cottage, I googled similar paranormal sightings. Apparently, melonheads, a band of feral children with enlarged heads, have been spotted in Michigan's forests, only a couple of hours from where we were. They might also have been black-eyed kids, although when I asked my girlfriend if she noticed black eyes, she said she was sure the boy's eyes weren't black. She would have remembered that. Still, his mannerisms, as she described them, sounded eerily similar to stories I've read about BEKs, black-eyed kids, so it's a possibility. If anyone has insight into this or has had similar experiences, I'd love to hear about it. The whole thing still creeps me out to this day, and on our trip home from Petoskey, we ended up taking a completely different route, just to avoid going through those woods again. That evening I trudged through the front door feeling grimy from another too-long shift at the hardware store. Everything was routine until I noticed Benny, my bulldog mix, acting off. Normally he'd pounce around, eager for attention. Instead he hovered near the couch as if expecting trouble. I called his name. He inched forward but stayed low to the floor, shooting wary glances at the back door. My girlfriend, Sam, glanced up from her spot in the kitchen, eyebrows raised. "He's been like that for the past hour," she said. "I tried taking him out earlier, but he whined and backed away. Figured he just sensed another stray cat." She shrugged, but I picked up on the unease creeping into her voice too. I told her I'd handle Benny's walk, thinking a breath of fresh air might help. Usually I step outside and breathe in the swampy odor of southern Mississippi, that damp mix of mud and moss. This time the yard felt strangely cloaked in silence. Even the neighborhood frogs and cicadas, my usual nighttime soundtrack, seemed to be missing. The porch light buzzed overhead, casting a faint glow across the patchy grass. Benny stayed close to my leg as we headed around the side of the house. Most nights, he's fearless, tugging me toward the fence to sniff out whatever smells nature left behind. Tonight, he looked ready to bolt at any moment. Still, I kept going, shining a little flashlight at the ground to avoid stepping on any stray branches or slick mud. The second we rounded the corner, something about the air felt oppressive. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on exhaustion or the humidity. We reached our usual spot near the shed, just a basic metal structure that rises about 6 feet high at its peak. Benny did what he came out to do, but the hair on his back was stiff as bristles. That's when I noticed movement in the gloom behind the shed. My focus snapped to a shadow that seemed to stretch taller than the roof itself. It was like a column of darkness sliding between the trees. A single heartbeat later, the shape darted sideways, too fast to be a person, too large to be any stray dog. Benny let out a strangled yelp and bolted. I was so startled I nearly dropped the flashlight. Trying not to panic, I sprinted after him, nearly slipping in the damp grass. Benny reached the porch in record time, scratching at the door. I grabbed the doorknob, flung it open, and the two of us tumbled inside. I collapsed against the wall, pulse thudding in my ears. Sam rushed over. "What happened?" she asked, eyes darting between Benny and me. She must have seen my face, because her own expression went pale. I forced myself to speak, though the words tangled in my throat. "Something's out there," I managed, avoiding the window as I fumbled to lock the door. Sam reached for Benny, who huddled by her ankles, refusing to budge. Tension clung to the three of us like static. I didn't know what I had seen, only that it moved in a way that defied every logical explanation I could come up with. I realized we needed to check the yard before I drove myself nuts imagining possibilities. Though my instincts screamed to stay put, the pull of curiosity was too strong. Sam and I exchanged a long look, both of us unsettled but unwilling to ignore what might be lurking in the darkness. We decided we had to find out. If we didn't, the fear would fester all night, gnawing at us. Flashlights in hand, we prepared to step into that heavy stillness once more, uncertain whether we'd come back any wiser, or just more terrified. I couldn't just stand by and wonder what lurked in those trees, so I decided to see if my neighbor Walter had any idea. He's been around these parts longer than anyone, plus he keeps a bunch of hunting dogs. If something unusual was moving through the swamp, he'd probably have a clue. Sam stayed on our front porch, flashlight in hand, clearly uneasy about me leaving. Benny hovered behind her, ears pinned flat. He usually trailed me everywhere, but not tonight. After promising I wouldn't be gone long, I headed across the yard, hyper-aware of the dark shapes and rustling sounds in the distance. Walter was on his porch, shining a lantern around like he expected trouble. His old hound dogs yapped in their kennels, a nervous, restless noise. When he spotted me, he waved me over with a grim nod. "You hear anything strange back there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Walter scratched his beard, admitting he heard something pacing around the swamp earlier, but he figured it was an alligator, or maybe coyotes. I explained what happened earlier in my own yard, including the massive silhouette and the fence that nearly got rocked off its hinges. Walter's expression shifted. He'd dealt with all manner of local wildlife, but my story put him on edge. Without a word, he picked up a rifle. Even though he's a seasoned hunter, something about his posture told me he wasn't ready for what we might find. We crept along the fence line at the back of his property. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough to see the twisted trunks of cypress trees and the murky water gathered around their roots. Every so often, I heard this squelching, like something large was shifting in the mud deeper in the swamp. Walter and I edged forward, flashlights darting across the undergrowth. The dogs kept barking, and my nerves were on edge. The next moment, the fence between us and the swamp rattled so violently that my ears rang from the impact. The whole thing quivered as though struck by a truck, boards grinding in protest. Walter reflexively fired a shot into the darkness. We peered through the beams of our flashlights, but nothing moved. No footprints, no sign of an animal. Still, we sensed a presence, something nearby, watching. Then we heard a voice. At least, it sounded like a voice, but in a language I'd never heard. It was garbled, wet, and seemed to echo from all directions. Walter's breath caught. This was obviously new territory for him too. I took an involuntary step back. Every instinct told me we were in deep trouble, messing with something that knew these marshes better than we did. Walter motioned for me to get out of there, so I didn't argue. We hurried back toward his house, flashlights bouncing wildly off the trees. My lungs felt tight, adrenaline crashing through my veins. By the time we got to his back porch, the fence was still rattling, even though no one, and nothing, stood there. I shot one last look over my shoulder. The swamp was silent again, but not in any comforting way. It felt more like waiting. Walter gave me a stiff nod, letting me know he'd be okay, though I could see fear etched on his face. I sprinted home, heart pounding, desperate to get behind locked doors and figure out how I was going to keep my family safe from something that defied explanation. The second I stepped onto my own porch, Sam rushed into my arms. Benny finally inched forward, tail low, as if he could sense how spooked I was. I told them both what happened, though my words spilled out in pieces. All I knew was that everything had changed. This swamp we'd called home for so long was hiding something, and it was closer than any of us wanted to believe. No more than 10 minutes had passed since I'd sprinted home from Walter's place. I tried to steady my breathing, but it stayed ragged as Sam and I hovered by the kitchen table. Benny refused to leave my side, pacing in circles with his eyes fixed on the doorway. I was in the middle of telling Sam every horrible detail when the entire house lurched, like a sudden earthquake had hit our tiny patch of land. Windows rattled. A bang so intense that my insides twisted around each other rippled through the neighborhood. A brief flicker in the power caused the overhead light to dim, then sputter back to life. Sam dropped her phone, and Benny whimpered in confusion. I ran to the window expecting to see flames or some sign of destruction, but there was only darkness, and that eerie quiet. Several neighbors gathered in the street almost instantly, flashlights bouncing over the asphalt. Walter emerged from his house looking frazzled, rifle still clutched in his grip. One of the neighbors, an older woman named Jeannie, pointed into the swamp, swearing she'd noticed some flickering blue glow in the distance right before the explosion. Others mumbled about feeling the ground shake beneath them. The way everyone's voices trembled told me we were all grappling with the same sinister thought. Something unnatural resided out there, and it was getting bolder. Sam and I joined the group. The moment we set foot beyond the lawn, an uneasy prickling sensation crept over my skin, as if we were all being observed. Nobody had an explanation. Any conversation about it, or whatever's out there, just trailed off. In that silence, the swamp loomed, soaked in shadows and stillness. Police arrived soon after, a pair of officers with tense expressions. They questioned us in turn, jotting down notes. When Walter told them about the fence being slammed by an invisible force, they exchanged a look that practically screamed they wanted no part in chasing something through a swamp at night. Even hearing about the unintelligible voice left them shifting on their feet. By the time they finished taking statements, it was clear they were going to file their report and head out, not stick around to figure out the cause of that detonation. Once the patrol car disappeared down the street, we all realized we had no one else to rely on. People retreated to their homes, locking doors that had never been locked before in this small community. Walter shot me a knowing glance. His presence had always been a comfort, like he'd protected this neighborhood for decades, but now he appeared just as spooked as the rest of us. Sam and I hurried back inside, triple-checking every window latch. Benny stationed himself near the front door, hackles raised, ready to spring. The residue of that massive bang still hung in the air, leaving my nerves on edge. Every little creak of the house sounded magnified. Every distant rustle in the yard made me tense up. Time crawled. We clicked on every lamp, determined to ward off the oppressive darkness outside. No official explanation ever surfaced for the blast. Neighbors whispered about illegal activities in the swamp. But even the more skeptical folks couldn't ignore the stories trickling through our small cluster of homes. Stories of a colossal shape weaving through the murk, and a voice that belonged to no person. Days later, I was still peeking out back windows whenever night fell. The entire place felt different, like we'd stirred up an ancient hornet's nest. Every so often I recalled the colossal figure near my shed, the way the fence shook at Walter's place, and the terrifying language echoing through the undergrowth. I never got answers, and maybe that made it worse, knowing something monstrous might still be roaming those swampy woods, waiting for the right moment to let us know it was still there. I remember how the gravel road seemed to stretch on forever that evening, the sky tinted with the kind of murky orange that shows up right before night swallows the last bit of daylight. I was crammed in Uncle Grant's old SUV with Aunt Beverly and my cousin Jeff, all of us worn out from the long drive. We were heading to this supposedly cozy cabin near a lake in northwestern Pennsylvania for my cousin's wedding weekend. Everyone acted excited, but there was this electric tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. When we finally turned off the main road and reached the property, I got this weird sensation in my stomach. The cabin looked older than any photos we'd seen online. Its porch slanted at an angle, and the wooden steps creaked under our feet. Something about the way the trees surrounded the clearing made me feel like we were being watched. Naturally, I told myself it was just exhaustion. Aunt Beverly teased me, saying I was always looking for spooky thrills. I tried to laugh it off, but I caught myself checking over my shoulder more than once. Inside, the place had this stale odor that reminded me of forgotten storage rooms. Each floorboard groaned whenever someone shifted weight. The walls were practically bare, except for a few faded pictures of the lake pinned up here and there. When I flicked the overhead light, it flickered ominously before settling into a weak glow. Uncle Grant declared it charming. Meanwhile, I found myself eyeing odd scratches on the front door, long, jagged marks that didn't look like normal wear. I pointed them out, and he shrugged, said something about a previous tenant's dog, but it didn't feel right. We set about unpacking a few groceries. The fridge rattled like it might give up at any second. Some insects scurried across the counter, vanishing under a faded dish towel. I jumped back, feeling my skin crawl, but Jeff just laughed and handed me a paper towel to shoo them away. I tried to stay calm, though every clink and squeak in that house made me more on edge. The wind began to pick up, and the windows rattled, almost like an unseen hand was testing them from the outside. After a quick dinner, we all headed for bed, but I wasn't sure if I'd sleep at all. Uncle Grant stayed up to watch a late show on TV, muttering about wanting to smoke a last cigarette. I fell into a restless doze on the living room couch, with the sound of crickets outside blending into the hum of the old TV. Some time passed before I noticed Uncle Grant quietly slipping out the front door. I pulled a blanket over my shoulders, trying to drift off again. I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, Uncle Grant was back inside, locking up with more gusto than usual. He whispered my name, and I sat up, feeling my pulse thrum harder than it should. He said he'd heard this loud banging, like someone was smashing a sheet of metal in the distance, over and over, but with no rhythm or explanation. No crunch of leaves, no voices, nothing else. Just those jarring metallic thuds echoing around the woods. I wanted to tell him it was just old pipes clanging, or maybe random machinery from a nearby property, but even I didn't believe myself. The way he looked, eyes darting from window to window, made it impossible to dismiss outright. I tried to be the steady one, telling him not to worry, that it was probably nothing. Still, every nerve in my body was jumping, convinced something about this house and the land around it was off. He headed to his room, and I was left alone in the dimly lit living area. The television buzzed quietly, its glow flickering on the wall. Every so often the floor would make a snapping noise as though someone was pacing in the hallway. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to think of anything else. I didn't get much rest. Maybe I was waiting for the banging to start again, or half expecting to hear a knock at the door. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamt about silhouettes lurking among the trees, their outlines barely visible. By the time morning rolled around, my nerves were shot, and we still had another night to endure in that place. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everything I felt was just tension from the long trip. But deep down, I suspected there was more to it. Something I couldn't quite identify, yet couldn't ignore. Sunlight streamed through the windows way too early for my liking. I'd hardly slept, and I was still on edge from the strange banging Uncle Grant had heard the night before. We all trudged into the kitchen for breakfast, quietly picking at toast and eggs. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit how tense things felt. Aunt Beverly tried joking about the crazy raccoons that must have been making a racket outside. Jeff chimed in with something sarcastic about Bigfoot. But Uncle Grant kept glancing out the window, like he was expecting something to be lurking just beyond the tree line. I decided I needed fresh air, even though the atmosphere outside felt just as heavy. As I stepped off the porch, the morning chill hit me, and I caught sight of the ground near the car. There were these odd impressions in the mud, bigger than my footprints, definitely not shaped like any tracks I'd recognize. The outline looked elongated, maybe even distorted, with a few weird indentations that reminded me of claws. It didn't look like a bear, or any dog I'd come across. I knelt down, pressing my hand near one of them for size comparison, and a wave of unease stirred in me again. My mind was racing with rational explanations. Maybe the ground had just eroded weirdly, or some animal's paws had slipped in the rain. Still, it felt off. I stood there a moment, debating whether to share it with the others. Eventually, I settled on keeping it to myself. I didn't want to add to the tension that was already hanging over us. We spent most of the afternoon in a flurry of wedding activities. It should have been a nice escape, but every time I glanced at Uncle Grant, I could tell the previous night was still bugging him. Aunt Beverly kept trying to lighten the mood, but it never really stuck. The ceremony went fine. People were laughing, sipping champagne, and talking about the newlyweds. If someone noticed our restless energy, they were polite enough not to mention it. By the time we got back to the cabin, I was physically exhausted, yet oddly wired. Aunt Beverly and Jeff went straight to their rooms, complaining about the long day, while Uncle Grant plopped onto the couch, flicking the TV on for some background noise. I stood by the window, half-heartedly checking out my reflection. My mind wouldn't let go of those footprints in the mud. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to step outside. I told myself I just needed a moment alone, that I was blowing everything out of proportion. The back porch light was weak and flickered like it might go out at any second. The trees formed a dark outline against the sky, and the distant lake shimmered faintly. For a moment, I actually felt a hint of calm, like maybe we were all just tired and spooked over nothing. Then a voice cut through the stillness calling my name, loud, urgent, and sounding exactly like Uncle Grant. The tone was forceful, coming from the direction of the front yard. My heart thumped painfully, and I nearly stumbled over my feet. It made no sense. Uncle Grant was inside on the couch. I hadn't heard the front door open, hadn't seen any movement near the porch. Yet there it was, calling for me again. The emptiness around the cabin seemed to intensify, as though everything else had stopped to listen. I practically leapt for the back door, throwing it open and racing into the living room. Uncle Grant was there, half asleep, remote in hand. The TV droned some late-night program, and he blinked in confusion when I rushed in. My words came out too quickly. "Were you outside? Did you just yell for me?" He just stared blankly, shaking his head. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing. There was no possible way he could have been outside yelling my name, and then back in front of the TV in a matter of seconds. I wanted a reasonable explanation, but my mind kept circling back to those footprints, the banging, the oppressive feeling. Something about this place was off, no matter how skeptical I claimed to be. Uncle Grant insisted he hadn't even moved from the couch. I was left with that eerie echo of my own name still rattling around in my thoughts. I couldn't sleep. I tried lying down, but every little creak in the house had me sitting up, half expecting to hear the voice again. The air inside felt stifling, and I kept replaying the entire day in my head. The footprints, the shifting tension at breakfast, that moment outside when I could have sworn I heard Uncle Grant. Hours dragged on. and I barely drifted off before dawn light started creeping through the old curtains. Looking back, I almost wish it had just been a prank, some elaborate joke to scare me. But the fear stirring inside me was too tangible for that. Something about the cabin, and whatever lurked around it, wasn't content to let us enjoy our stay in peace. And deep down, I already knew the worst part. We still had another morning to face in this place. Morning arrived with a gray, overcast light spilling into the living room. I could tell my eyes were puffy from hardly sleeping. Everyone else looked worn out too. Uncle Grant looked as though he'd been pacing all night. His shoulders tight, his knuckles white, as he clutched a mug of cold coffee. Aunt Beverly and Jeff were uncharacteristically quiet, practically tiptoeing around the cabin like they didn't want to set something off. The entire mood was suffocating, and I just wanted to be gone. I decided to head outside and check around before we packed up. Maybe there was some logical explanation waiting out there, something to rationalize this claustrophobic anxiety. That's when I noticed the side of the porch railing. Deep gouges marred the wood. Jagged edges splintered outward. They seemed too deliberate to be wind damage or an animal trying to claw its way up. Something about them felt purposeful, like a wordless warning. I almost called out for Uncle Grant but stopped myself, remembering how bizarre the voice had been the night before. Instead, I stepped closer, my stomach churning. Each scratch varied in length, and I could almost swear some had an odd shape, like crude symbols. Nothing I recognized, but clearly not random. It looked fresh, with wood shavings still hanging from the grooves. That set my pulse racing in a way I couldn't deny. Scrambling back inside, I found Uncle Grant stuffing clothes into his suitcase. The moment I mentioned fresh damage on the railing, he froze. Then, wordlessly, he resumed tossing things into bags, not bothering to fold or organize. It was clear we all agreed on one thing. We needed to leave as soon as possible. There was no more half-joking or rationalizing. The rush to pack felt frantic. Doors slammed, suitcases thumped against the wall. Jeff tripped over a stray extension cord and let out a string of curses that shattered the quiet. Aunt Beverly hastily grabbed leftover groceries, practically sprinting to the car. Every slam of a trunk or click of a door lock seemed too loud, echoing in the hollow morning air. I helped load everything, glancing at the perimeter of trees surrounding the property, convinced something was peering out from behind the thick trunks. A brisk wind stirred branches overhead, making the entire area feel alive and tense. Each time a shadow shifted, my senses went on high alert, but I never saw anything conclusive, just suggestions of movement and gloom. It was enough to keep me on edge until we finally shut the car doors and turned onto the gravel road. The moment we got a few miles away, my chest felt marginally lighter. The oppressive heaviness receded, and normal conversation began to trickle back. Uncle Grant muttered something about never returning to that place. Aunt Beverly looked out the window as if she couldn't believe the last 2 nights had happened. Jeff just stared at his phone, scrolling aimlessly, trying to distract himself. We all needed distance from whatever had been going on. When I got back to my own place, I reached out to my friend Martina. She's the type who devours cryptid documentaries and loves scouring obscure internet forums. I expected her to laugh off my story or tease me for getting jumpy. Instead, she listened intently, occasionally nodding with a grave expression. The moment I mentioned a voice that sounded exactly like Uncle Grant's, she cut in and described stories she'd read about creatures that mimic people's voices to lure victims out at night. Although I'd heard rumors of such folklore before, hearing it tied so closely to my own experience made my stomach knot. Martina explained how these tales often surface in mountain regions, but she said legends can pop up anywhere dense forests and remote cabins exist. People vanish under strange circumstances, leaving behind little trace besides footprints or curious marks on wood or stone. That last part stuck with me, the memory of the porch railing. I recall standing there, thinking how carefully those scratches had been carved. Later that evening, I scoured the internet on my own, reading about disappearances, theories, and plenty of wild speculation. Not everything felt relevant, but I stumbled on a few accounts that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Unexplained knocks, distorted animal calls, or voices mimicking loved ones. An unsettling number of people wrote that responding to these calls often led them deeper into danger. Ever since, a lingering sense of unease has shadowed me, especially at night. I'll be in my living room, hear a random noise outside, and feel my heart pound. All those rational explanations I once clung to don't hold the same weight. And while I keep telling myself we got away in time, I can't stop wondering what might have happened if I'd followed the voice when it called to me. Part of me wishes it were a simple case of nerves, or an overactive imagination. Yet everything from the footprints to the metallic banging, the gouges in the wood, and that echo of my name in the dark suggests something more. I may never have solid proof, but that experience left a mark. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's driven off into the early morning light, convinced that something unnatural lurked in the trees behind them, waiting. It all started with the way the sky turned that yellowish-gray color, right before the clouds open up. I was sitting in our cramped living room, listening to the wind rattle the window frames, waiting for my parents to say goodbye before they drove off to their gig. The house wasn't much more than some creaky boards glued together with mismatched nails, and every storm felt like a personal attack on its fragile structure. My younger brother, Eric, was at the kitchen table, coloring in some old magazine pages, since we didn't have real coloring books. The tension in the air made everything feel off. When my folks finally headed out, I watched from the screen door as their beat-up sedan disappeared along the rain-slick dirt road. The plan was for Eric and me to camp out in the living room, maybe watch an old VHS tape if the power didn't conk out. Instead, I just paced around the tiny space, eyes darting to the windows every time the wind made them shudder. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Fat drops pounding the roof, thunder rolling through the valley like distant explosions. I decided to check on Moose, our so-called guard dog. He was more lanky than intimidating, and my dad had tied him to a rusted engine block on the screened porch. It wasn't pretty, but it kept him from wandering off. Moose was usually pretty mellow, spending his days flopped on the porch, only barking at random shadows now and then. Tonight, though, the wind had him shifting around, ears back, tail tucked. The second I opened the porch door to see if he was okay, it nearly blew off its hinges, letting in a gust of wet air that chilled the entire front hall. Moose perked up, probably wondering if I was taking him inside, but my dad never allowed that. Before I could check the knots on his chain, the wind slammed again. This time, the front door's flimsy latch gave way and it wrenched completely loose from the frame. It felt like a giant had peeled it back just for fun. Moose freaked out and jerked against the chain, which scraped along the concrete floor of the porch with a shrill metallic sound. By the time I turned around, he was already lunging outside, trailing that chain behind him. The sight of our only watchdog bolting into a raging storm sent a jolt of panic straight through my gut. I slammed a foot against the door, what was left of it anyway, just to keep more rain from rushing in. Eric, eyes wide, stood in the hallway, his little hands clenched in fear. I had this moment of indecision. Should I chase Moose? Should I stay inside and hope he came back? My parents would never believe I'd done everything I could if that dog went missing. And Eric was too young to help, so I told him to stay put and not open any doors no matter what. We didn't have a real lock to secure the front, just a rusty hook latch that hung crooked from the wood. But it was the best we could do. I grabbed my father's giant rubber boots from the corner. They nearly swallowed my legs, but they were the only protection I had from the ankle-deep water forming outside. No flashlight in sight. Either I forgot in the rush, or I was too rattled to think straight. The wind roared like it was daring me to come out. And I did. The rain hit me so hard it might as well have been hail. It felt like the storm was trying to drive me back into the house, but I forced my way across the yard, yelling Moose's name. A flash of lightning revealed a quick glimpse of him scrambling down the back slope, heading for the creek. That creek was already more of a raging stream from the downpour, and our makeshift bridge was basically 2 planks set across the bank. I let out a shaky breath, not that it helped, and charged after him. Mud sucked at my boots with each step, and thunder pounded overhead. I could see branches flailing, the trees bent at unnatural angles. Everything looked like it might snap at any second. Despite the roaring wind, I managed to pick out the scrape of Moose's chain. It guided me like a beacon, though it was faint and easily drowned out by each thunderclap. I lost track of time stomping through the yard. Maybe it was a minute, maybe 10. Finally, I reached the creek just as another jagged bolt of lightning streaked across the sky. The old planks were slick and crooked, but I had no choice. I gingerly stepped on the wood, praying I wouldn't slip into the raging water. For a split second I glanced behind me toward the house. The dim glow from our living room window was barely visible through the sheets of rain. I wished I could turn around and retreat, but Moose was out there alone, and that thought twisted my stomach. So I pushed on, crossing the bridge in 2 large strides, boots squelching loudly. The sound of Moose's chain seemed further up toward the mountain. The slope beyond the creek was a tangle of briars and soggy leaves, and it didn't help that darkness clung to every inch of the forest. One misstep, and I'd be sliding down into the water, or worse. Still, it was better than going home empty-handed to face my father's wrath. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep moving. Overhead, thunder boomed again, so powerful it rattled my ribs. The forest ahead swayed as if alive, full of silhouettes shifting against each other. Something about it felt unnatural, like it was quietly waiting for me, biding its time. My pulse hammered away, and my thoughts spun with every possible bad scenario. All I knew was, Moose was out there, and I had to find him before something else did. I gritted my teeth, hands shaking, and started up the slope. If I were lucky, Moose was just around the bend, maybe tangled in a bush. If not, well, I tried not to think about that. Either way, there was no going back. I trudged forward, the roar of the storm making every step feel like I was venturing deeper into another world. The creek was just behind me, its water raging loud enough to drown out almost everything else. I'd crossed on those slippery planks, heart pounding in my ears, so it took me a second to realize that Moose's chain had gone quiet. The silence felt wrong somehow. Even with the rain pounding leaves and the thunder crashing above, I had this deep sense that something out here was holding its breath. I kept calling Moose's name, my voice ragged. A flash of lightning lit the trees for an instant, revealing the chaos of the forest floor, tangled undergrowth, small streams of runoff winding between boulders, and everything slicked with water. No sign of Moose. I pushed on, boots squelching in ankle-deep mud. The wind whistled between branches, almost like it was whispering warnings I couldn't quite understand. After another minute of struggling uphill, that smell hit me. It was a stench so foul my throat seized in protest, like rotting meat left out in the summer heat. I'd come across dead animals before out in the Appalachian wilderness, but this was different. It was stronger, like a carcass that had been there a week or more, oozing and attracting flies. Except I couldn't hear any flies, just the thumping of the storm around me. Whatever it was, it made me want to turn around and run, but I forced myself to keep going. If Moose had gotten hurt or tangled somewhere, I couldn't leave him. My eyes watered from the vile odor, and the mud sucked at each step. A branch snapped overhead, making me jump, like something had stepped on it. I whipped around, but all I saw was the black swirl of the forest in the downpour. I tried to swallow back the dread and called out again, "Moose!" My voice came out sounding desperate, bouncing off wet trunks. The thunder grumbled its response. No chain sounds, no whining dog, nothing. Lightning flashed once more, cutting the darkness for maybe half a second. In that brief light, I spotted something pale on the ground a few yards away. My stomach churned as I took a cautious step closer. It looked like an animal's rib cage, possibly a deer's, picked clean to the bone. The edges were dark and ragged, as if something had gnawed on them. Rainwater and mud slicked the remains, making the bones gleam unnaturally. I felt a wave of nausea, but terror kept me from throwing up. The wind gusted hard, and the leaves overhead thrashed as though furious I was still there. I realized the smell might be coming from that carcass, but it felt like there was more to it. Like something else was in the air, beyond just death. Something old and malevolent. Then lightning illuminated the area once again, but this time I noticed that certain patches of the forest weren't lighting up at all. It was as if a section of the trees had been painted with ink so black the light refused to touch it. I blinked, trying to clear rainwater from my eyes, certain it had to be a trick of shadows. Except, it stayed there, a dense void where tree trunks and undergrowth should have been. Suddenly, I heard a barking frenzy. My head snapped to the right, and in the dim, stuttering light, Moose bounded into view, chain clattering on rocks. He was soaked and wild-eyed, barking at that patch of darkness. I yelled his name again, voice cracking in relief. He kept barking, the chain tangling around his legs as he inched closer to the void. Every instinct in me screamed to keep him away from whatever that was. I stumbled forward, arms flailing for balance, and managed to snatch the chain just before he lunged. Moose's hackles were raised, and a low growl rattled in his throat. The barking stopped abruptly, as if he realized we were both in serious danger. Then a low rumble echoed from higher up the slope, a sound deeper than any animal I'd encountered. It felt like it vibrated through my ribs, so heavy I nearly lost my balance in the mud. That was enough for both of us. I yanked Moose back, and we started downhill. Calling it a retreat would be an understatement. It was a panicked scramble. The ground seemed determined to keep us there, slipping under my feet. Every time lightning revealed tree limbs, we jerked around them, half expecting something massive to burst through the brush. Moose fought the chain in terror, but for once he and I were on the same page. We needed to get out of there, and fast. The descent was a blur of snapping twigs and thorns slicing at my arms. Rain plastered my hair to my face, forcing me to wipe my eyes constantly. I barely kept track of Moose's chain in my hand. A flash of lightning was followed by the biggest boom of thunder I'd heard all night. It rattled the leaves off nearby branches. The steep slope made me feel like I was skiing on wet leaves. My boots slipped, and I nearly fell face first into the muck. Behind me, a loud crash echoed, like a gigantic branch broke under tremendous weight. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was whatever made that growl. I didn't even want to look back. The only thing that mattered was getting Moose and me across that creek and back to the house. When I finally spotted the creek below, lightning flickered again. For a split second I swear I glimpsed a tall, vaguely distorted shape higher up on the slope. The very air around it seemed to bend. I squeezed Moose's chain, practically dragging him the last few yards. The planks that served as our bridge looked even more rickety now, half submerged by the swollen water. With no real plan, I splashed across, water sloshing into my boots. Moose leapt beside me, spattering mud everywhere. Another vicious gust hammered the trees, and I heard a crunch of wood. My imagination, or maybe not, conjured the idea that something huge was only a dozen yards behind us, snapping branches in its path. I didn't wait to confirm. Moose and I stumbled back into what was left of our yard, the faint glow from the house's window like a beacon. My legs burned with exhaustion, and my lungs stung from breathing so hard. The storm still raged, but as awful as it was, it felt safer than whatever lurked deeper in the forest. The door had swung shut behind me when I left, and I could see Eric's small face pressed to the glass, eyes large. He was waiting, probably terrified. Moose and I darted up the muddy slope to the porch. I nearly collapsed onto the door, fumbling to get it open. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the latch. Finally it gave, and we toppled inside. I slammed the door behind us, though there wasn't much left of it to bolt. Rain dripped from my clothes in a steady trail. Moose shook himself, spraying water all over. Still breathing hard, I pressed my ear to the door, half expecting something to slam against it. But all I heard was the storm raging outside. Eric stood by the dim lamp on the side table, looking so small that my heart hurt to see him. He opened his mouth to ask a question, maybe about what happened out there, but I just raised a hand, still gasping. There was nothing I could say that would make sense. Not yet. Instead, I walked over to the window, parted the threadbare curtain a fraction, and looked out into the darkness. My eyes strained to spot any movement or shape. The rain blurred everything into a shifting mess of shadows. Yet I couldn't shake the idea that something was still out there, watching, listening, waiting. In that moment, the storm outside no longer felt like the biggest threat. Something else was lurking in the Appalachian Mountains that night, and I'd come terrifyingly close to it. I had no clue what it was, or how it had stayed hidden. All I knew was that we'd barely gotten away, and I didn't want to test our luck twice. By morning, I was running on fumes. I'd spent most of the night in the living room, fighting the urge to fall asleep. Eric dozed in a chair with Moose curled at his feet. A rare moment of calm for that dog, who was still damp from our sprint through the storm. The rain finally started letting up at sunrise, and it gave me just enough courage to crack open the busted door and peer out. The yard looked waterlogged and torn up, like a battleground of mud and broken branches. Before I could decide whether to investigate the creek, my parents barged in, complaining about the warped door. My dad, wearing an old denim jacket spotted with rain, took one glance at the wood we'd rigged as a latch, and muttered something about lousy craftsmanship before turning on me. He wanted to know why the door was off its frame, why everything smelled like wet dog, and what had happened during the night. My explanation came out rushed and jumbled. Moose ran off. I chased him. The storm was insane. Something in the woods. He cut me off with a wave of his hand. The expression on his face said he was in no mood for what he believed were wild stories. He turned around and stomped out the door, grumbling that he'd check for any real damage and see if any punks messed with our stuff. My mother followed, giving me a tired look that hovered between concern and annoyance. I stood there, knuckles sore from gripping Moose's chain so tight the night before. A part of me wanted to just let my dad go, but my gut told me I should see what he found at the creek. The memory of that snarling sound, the rotten smell, and the impossible darkness clung to my mind like a stain. Eric stayed inside to calm Moose while I stepped out into the dreary morning. Rain still dripped from the gnarled trees overhead. The sky was a dull gray that made everything look washed out, except for scattered piles of shattered wood leading toward the creek. I followed the splinters, my boots sliding in patches of thick mud. My parents were already ahead, kicking their way down the slope. The bridge, or what was left of it, looked like something had crushed and shredded it overnight. Chunks of rotted plank lay in the swollen water, and jagged spikes stuck up at odd angles. My dad crouched on the muddy bank, running his hand over a broken piece. His lips tightened in anger. "Kids with no respect," he said under his breath, though he didn't explain how any kid could have snapped boards in such a savage way. My mom glanced over at me, her eyebrows raised. She hadn't said much since we got here, just stared at the destruction with a pale face. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to reconcile this with the idea of some troublemakers running around in the rain. It didn't fit, and I think she knew it, but she wasn't about to admit it out loud. The smell of decay had faded somewhat, replaced by the dank odor of morning fog and wet earth, but I couldn't shake the memory of it. I shuffled closer to the water, scanning the opposite bank. The forest beyond seemed calm, just dripping leaves and the faint babble of the creek. In broad daylight, there was no sign of that strange void or the presence I sensed before. It was like the mountain had returned to its usual self, just another stretch of Appalachians brimming with wild critters and tall trees. My dad grabbed a loose plank and threw it aside. He gestured for me to come over and pointed at deep scratches along the wood. "Teeth marks?" he snapped, as though I was the expert. The edges were jagged, as if something had gnawed or torn at the plank with an unbelievable force. He shook his head. "Beavers, maybe," he mumbled, though I'd never heard of beavers large enough to snap a thick board in one bite. He stood up, rubbing his hands on his jacket, looking over the muddy mess. "I'll have to fix this," he said, then shot me a glare. "Next time, keep that dog under control. We can't afford to replace everything he tears up." I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't Moose, but I could already see the disbelief in his eyes. He'd made up his mind that local hoodlums or some oversized animal caused all the chaos. We made our way back toward the house, my dad muttering plans to gather more wood and reinforce the place. My mom trailed behind him, arms crossed. I suspected she had questions about what really happened, but she stayed quiet. I had a bunch of questions myself, and none of them had good answers. Inside, Eric was petting Moose, who seemed exhausted, like he had no fight left. The dog wouldn't even look at the door, and every time a gust of wind shook the house, he pressed himself tighter against Eric's legs. My parents wanted breakfast and coffee, so they shooed us out of the kitchen. We ended up back in the living room, facing the window that gave a perfect view of the yard and the dripping woods beyond. Eric whispered, "Was it a bear?" I shook my head, not sure how to respond. A bear might tear up a plank, sure, but the snarl I'd heard on the slope wasn't quite animal. I thought about telling him everything, the black void, the smell, the mangled carcass I saw, but I couldn't bring myself to terrify him even more. We'd barely slept as it was. The day rolled on, dull and gloomy, with my parents hauling tools out to patch up the front door. I stood in the yard, eyes drifting toward the tree line. In normal weather, it was just a typical patch of forest, crowded with ferns and oak trees, occasional deer tracks. Now I pictured the twisted remains of the bridge and that unnatural darkness hidden somewhere up the slope, waiting for another storm or another unwary wanderer. My mom called me to help with the door, so I wandered back and hammered nails where my dad pointed, trying not to think about the place beyond the creek. It felt like just a few short hours ago, we'd been running for our lives, certain that something monstrous was on our heels. But with the daylight creeping in, nobody wanted to mention it. Nobody wanted to believe anything unexplainable lurked this close to our house. Eventually, when the door was half fixed, my parents turned their attention to the yard and started ranting about muddy footprints and the battered porch. The tension in the house was like a tightening knot. Nobody felt safe, but we all pretended it was just a typical morning after a storm. I retreated to my room for a bit, peeling off the filthy clothes I still had on. Part of me wanted to ask if we could leave, even for a day, go stay with someone else until the weather cleared. But we barely had enough gas money to get my parents to their gig. They weren't about to up and vacate the house because of one scary night. I kept glancing out my window, half expecting a sudden movement near the tree line. Nothing showed, just water dripping from branches and leftover fog hugging the base of the mountains. Under a normal sky, it might even look serene. But I'd seen what the night could hide. My heart thudded every time I remembered that rumbling growl echoing through the storm. The next few hours dragged on. Eric tried to calm Moose with bits of food, but the dog wouldn't leave his side. My parents acted like the real villain was the wind, or maybe some vandals who'd chosen the worst weather possible to play pranks. Nobody acknowledged that the broken bridge, splintered into fragments, was too extreme for a casual prank. Nobody wanted to confront the idea that something beyond ordinary had trampled those planks into matchsticks. Once the evening arrived, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. The sky was clearing, stars beginning to peek out. Normally, I'd be relieved to see no more rain, but a clear night meant every dark corner of the forest stood out in sharp detail. I caught myself scanning the window again, searching the edges for any shape that didn't belong. There was no sign of that darkness, or the stench of decay, yet I couldn't convince myself it was truly gone. The Appalachians had plenty of hidden corners, caves and hollows, where something could live without being disturbed. Maybe it only came out in storms, or maybe we'd simply stumbled upon its territory at the wrong moment. I hated not knowing. I helped Eric settle in for the night, keeping Moose next to us. We sat on the worn couch, lights off, just quietly looking at the window. Sometimes you can feel safer in the dark if you think nothing can see you. Yet I was aware of everything, every creak in the rafters, every gust of wind outside. A branch scraped the roof, and I nearly jumped. But no monstrous shadow loomed at the window. No chain-rattling chase played out in the yard. When my parents finally turned in, the house fell into an uneasy silence. Eric drifted to sleep eventually, arms wrapped around Moose like a security blanket. I sat there, staring past their forms at the night beyond the window, gripping the couch cushions until my fingers hurt. The moonlight made the tree line visible, turning the shapes of trunks and tangled branches into black silhouettes. Part of me tried to believe nothing was out there, but it was a hollow belief. Somewhere in those mountains, something was waiting, something I'd practically run headlong into when chasing moose. Something that snapped planks, left bones in the mud, and made a sound that shook the ground like a tremor. I just prayed it wasn't peering back this way, remembering my scent. The idea set my heart rattling in my chest, and so I sat through the night wide awake, glancing at the window every time a breeze stirred a branch. If the thing from the storm decided to come back, I knew our patched-up door wouldn't be enough to keep it out. But all I could do was cling to hope that daylight would keep it at bay, that maybe this horror was finished with us, or at least satisfied enough to leave us alone for a while longer. I've lived in a secluded corner of Southwest Virginia my whole life. No cable, no internet, and no nearby neighbors. Just rolling hills, thick forests, and a handful of dusty back roads connecting everything. Most folks would feel uneasy, but I always liked the isolation. I learned to hunt before I was old enough to drive. Fishing and wandering through the undergrowth became my version of hanging out with friends. Maybe that sounds lonely, but it shaped who I am. It also set the stage for the night I nearly questioned my own sanity. It started out like any other coon hunt. We had these young hounds, not exactly champion-level trackers. We'd usually tromp out under the stars with high hopes of hearing them open on a raccoon trail. I still remember stepping into the night air, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the muffled bark one of the pups gave as we walked down an overgrown path. I was already picturing a successful catch and a good story to tell at the next family gathering. After I turned the dogs loose, though, the woods went still. Not the normal kind of quiet you get in nature. No wind rustling the branches, no distant call from an owl. Even the usual nighttime insects felt like they were holding back. I whistled for the dogs, expecting at least one of them to let me know where they ran off to. Nothing. Their silence was unnerving. Part of me wondered if they had chased a deer too far away, but I convinced myself it was just a slow start to the night. I decided to cut across a cow field to see if I could spot them. The field offered a clear view of the ridgeline above, which was normally black against the moonlit sky. But as soon as I stepped into that open space, a strange redness caught my eye. It stretched across the ridge in a wide band, like someone had hung a massive red curtain over the treetops. There were no flickers of flame, no smoke in the air, just a steady glowing light that seemed impossibly bright for this neck of the woods. My pulse pounded. I kept trying to come up with a logical reason, maybe a group of off-road trucks with brake lights on, or some heavy machinery. But this was miles from a main road, and no engine sounds broke the silence. I crouched low and switched the birdshot shell in my shotgun for a slug, just in case. My hands were trembling, and it felt like the emptiness around me was closing in. I glanced back toward the tree line, torn between sneaking closer to see what was happening or turning tail and heading home. In the end, I chose caution. I backed away, doing my best to move quietly, each step crunching grass and snapping twigs far louder than I liked. I worried something or someone might spot me if I turned on my flashlight, so I navigated using the faint moonlight. By the time I made it to the old dirt road that led home, I was breathing hard, clutching my shotgun so tight my knuckles hurt. The dogs were already at the house, sitting next to their kennels like nothing had happened. But my parents weren't thrilled I'd cut the hunt short, said I should have gone after the hounds instead of giving up. That night, sleep felt impossible. The image of that red glow kept searing through my thoughts, and I was stuck wondering what on earth could produce a light so strange and powerful, without any sign of a normal fire. I tried explaining it, hoping my parents might offer some reassurance. All I got were stern looks about my so-called wild imagination. Deep down, I knew something out there had no explanation I could wrap my head around, and it left me with a sense of unease I couldn't talk away. The next morning, I got up before dawn, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen. That brilliant red glow wouldn't leave my mind. If it was some prank, whoever pulled it off had gone to extraordinary lengths. I tossed on my boots and coat, grabbed a flashlight, and made a beeline back to the ridge. Part of me hoped I'd find ashes or footprints, Anything that would put my thoughts to rest. But there was nothing. Every tree looked the same as it always had. The ground was untouched by tire tracks, and no branches were snapped like you'd expect if vehicles had rumbled through. For a moment, I just stood there, feeling like I was wandering through someone else's dream. I spent hours picking over the underbrush and combing every inch of that field, coming up with zero evidence. It was maddening. I'd seen that glow with my own eyes, yet I couldn't prove it. Eventually, I dragged myself back home, my mind buzzing with possibilities. A trick of light, some forest phenomenon, or something more ominous. I didn't realize how anxious I was until I tried to talk about it with my stepdad that afternoon, and couldn't form the right words. He didn't tease or lecture, he just pulled me aside with an uneasy look. He mentioned he'd gone hunting a few nights after my incident, in an entirely different patch of woods. He was waiting for our dogs to bark when he witnessed 3 flashes of intense red lighting up the tree line. Each flash illuminated the forest around him like a camera strobe, except tinted crimson. He confessed he nearly dropped his rifle in shock. He flicked on his flashlight thinking maybe flares were being fired, but the woods were silent. No sign of people or emergency gear. It was gone as fast as it appeared. Hearing that rattled me. My stepdad doesn't scare easy, so to see him unsettled clued me in that we were dealing with something serious. Suddenly, my own brush with that glow felt a little less like a delusion, and more like a shared mystery. We spent the rest of the evening tossing around theories, secret military drills, an experimental aircraft, maybe even something that defies normal explanation. None of it clicked into place. Days slipped by, and each one felt a little more tense than the last. We'd do chores, feed the dogs, chat about everyday stuff, but it was obvious we were both distracted by the memory of that red light. I tried venting my confusion online, mostly local forums and social media groups. Eventually, I found a thread where someone described a red orb that had appeared in the sky about 10 miles away. The post was old, but they included grainy photos of a crimson object that shifted colors. Reading that made me uneasy in a completely different way. Instead of feeling singled out, I now realized we weren't the only ones who had seen something out of the ordinary. I shared those screenshots with my stepdad, and we just stared at them. Neither of us spoke right away, probably because we were trying to figure out if we preferred feeling alone in our experience, or knowing that others had witnessed something just as bizarre. If it was a hoax, it was a detailed one, but if it was real, then what was it doing in our little corner of Southwest Virginia? We never got a neat explanation. After a while, it stopped dominating our every conversation, but I noticed we both started carrying our rifles a little more carefully when we went out. I began scanning the horizon at dusk, imagining that eerie glow flickering back to life. Part of me almost wanted to see it again, just to confirm we hadn't lost our minds. The rest of me dreaded the possibility that it might reveal something we weren't prepared to handle. Those woods still feel like home. But there's an undercurrent of unease I can't shake. The questions hang in the air. What caused that radiant crimson light, and why choose these secluded hills to manifest? Without any answers, I just keep trudging up and down those ridges, wondering if I'll ever stumble upon the truth, or if the truth might one day find me. It was the fall of 2009, and I was 16 years old at the time. I lived in the central part of North Carolina. Nowadays, the cities are loaded with things to do for the Halloween season, but back then, the best form of entertainment I could come up with was visiting the Devil's Tramping Ground with a few friends. The Devil's Tramping Ground is a local legend. It sits right outside Siler City in North Carolina, about an hour away from where I lived, and I had just gotten my license, so why not? For those unfamiliar with the locale or its legend, the Devil's Tramping Ground is a perfectly circular patch of dead soil in the middle of the woods. Despite the surrounding greenery, nothing grows in that circle. Legend says that if you drop or leave anything in the circle, it's moved, or disappears, by morning, as the devil supposedly comes here late at night to plot his evil doings against humanity, pacing in a circle as he thinks. That's the gist. But feel free to research it. It's a decent read. Siler City is a sticks and barns town with long barren roads that practically scream, "Don't stop until you get the hell out of here." It was on one of those roads that I began to feel uneasy. Rural areas always have that heavy Twilight Zone energy, and the road we were on, conveniently named Devil's Tramping Ground RD, was entirely unlit. The only illumination for the cracked asphalt was the fading yellow headlights of my 2002 Mercury Cougar, and the faint glow of a crescent moon. In those dim lights, we started to see graffiti splattered on the road leading up to the place. Creepy warnings I didn't expect, and never realized the impact of, until I saw them. In white paint the road was marked with crude messages. The one I remember most said, "The devil lives here," and a huge white cross stood in front of an opening in the forest. I parked on the side of the road. The grounds itself wasn't as creepy as I'd expected. It wasn't very deep into the woods. In fact, the clearing was visible from the road. It wasn't as menacing as I'd imagined. Maybe it was the empty beer cans and red Solo cups scattered around. Obviously people partied there. Or maybe it was the jokes my friends and I started cracking almost immediately. But at around 2 a.m., we wanted to catch Lucifer at his hour. I felt less on edge than I had on the road. My flashlight beam seemed to vanish if I aimed it upward, so I kept it pointed at the soil, genuinely more interested in finding something paranormal than my friends were. There were 4 of us total. After a while, 2 of my friends went back to the car. It was cold, and not much was happening. I stayed behind with one friend. I had brought a Ziploc bag, along with a pocket Bible, a rosary in my pocket, just in case, and a stuffed rabbit given to me by one of my best friends. Before leaving, I scooped some of the dead soil into the Ziploc, curious to see if studying it later might provide a clue. Alien radiation, climate change, sulfur. Maybe the devil was just busy that night. Between joking and complaining about the cold, we suddenly heard someone walking in the depths of the woods. This wasn't a vague noise. This was a definite, heavy step. The sound came from behind the brush, among the trees, and it was unashamed of being heard. That was the first time I noticed there were no crickets or any other sounds at all. It was just us and these footsteps. I was even more reluctant to lift my small flashlight, which was tucked under my arm and pointed at my soil sample. My eyes had already adjusted to the dark, so we stood there, and I could make out the shape of something in the woods. It was dark, but I could see it. Tall, but not freakishly tall, human-shaped, walking on 2 feet. It would walk, then stop, then walk again, moving in our direction, I think. We were petrified, not moving or breathing. I was so afraid I felt numb, though I trembled a little. We just stared. Later, we'd talk about how we both wondered if it saw us, and how we didn't want to move in case it hadn't. We'd also talk about the smell, an awful, putrid stench of burning feces, rotting eggs, and decaying meat. I grew up Catholic, hence the Bible and rosary, and was taught that smell meant the devil was nearby, which only made things worse. Even now, typing this, I'm trembling a bit. This thing lingered among the skeletal branches, seemingly toying with us. I say skeletal because not much greenery was alive at the time. At some point, I was sure it saw me. I got that sixth sense feeling of being watched, and then an overwhelming despair washed over me. That's when I realized my friend had been clutching the back of my collar. I think I was so paralyzed with fear that I felt nothing but numbness. Wasn't even cold anymore. But once I felt my friend's hand, I dropped everything in my arms, stood up, and quickly headed back to the car. I didn't run outright, but it was a very hurried walk. I just assumed my friend was right behind me. To be honest, I didn't think much about it at the time. I was too ready to leave. I took off into the trees instead of following the clear path, heading toward the yellow glow of the headlights. Although the road was close by, it felt like an agonizingly long distance, enough for the small branches to scrape and cut my hands, cheeks, and neck. This whole ordeal couldn't have lasted very long. When I got back to my car, the keys were already in the ignition. The other 2 had turned on the heat, and they asked what had happened. My friend who stayed behind with me got in the passenger seat soon after, and we took off. The 2 in the car pointed out that our eyes were swollen and bright red. I think we had been crying without realizing it. Or at least it looked that way. In the rearview mirror, I saw my pupils were abnormally large, and my eyelids were puffy, tender, and red. Maybe it was just fear combined with the darkness, but it was still unsettling. I realized later I'd left my Bible, my stuffed rabbit, and my Ziploc bag of dirt in the circle. I thought about going back the next day when it was light out, but I never did. I still wonder and worry about who might have my things now. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin, on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To reach the island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellison Bay to Washington Island, drive across Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small, about 975 acres, it has an interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. The two groups did not trust each other and had a few bad encounters that almost led to violence, but for the most part they lived peacefully together. By the 1640s, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after the Potawatomi left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people there. They seemed to be more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. No one from the fishing village was ever able to speak with these newcomers, or even find where they were living. It was around this time that strange things started happening in the village. Several animals, possibly pigs or chickens kept by the settlers, were found slaughtered, and it seemed their blood had been used to make markings on some of the buildings. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers believed these acts were done by the new people on the island, and searched thoroughly, including the wooded inland area, but never found a single person. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of the other newcomers were ever seen again. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported that the material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are of the best quality, and that the work is done in a substantive and workmanlike manner. On December 19, 1837, David E. Corbin was appointed the first keeper of the light. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of the lighthouse, Corbin complained that plaster was beginning to fall off, and some sort of liquid oozed through cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. Corbin was alone most of the time at the lighthouse, and some visitors said he would stare at a certain wall, and sometimes spoke vaguely of other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relative solitude, an inspector visited Corbin at the lighthouse. While Corbin was fulfilling his duties, the inspector noted he was acting strangely. The official report says the inspector ordered Corbin to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife to live with him. However, some believe the inspector was startled by Corbin's mental state, brought on by years of solitude, and thought it best for him to spend some time away from the island. In 1852, Corbin reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery just south of the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported a surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Friends who visited him said he spoke of seeing strange things in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or a family living with them. No further strange occurrences were noted in the lighthouse logbook, outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The keeper at the time, named Betts, reported seeing 2 men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. A terrible storm came up shortly after their departure, and they never reached their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3, 1876, Betts wrote, "The 2 men who were lost last January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jacksonport, The men were apparently frozen stiff, and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account they were still adrift. There is not much hope that they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of Rock Island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thorderson, purchased all of the island except for the land occupied by the lighthouse in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Thorderson is responsible for the unique and mystifying buildings and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end, he built a giant stone hall with a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed on the west end. The Great Hall was used to store Thorderson's immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumored he possessed some very rare books on the occult. Thorderson died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated he saw something that scared him to death. I couldn't find any writings from Thorderson that mentioned him experiencing anything strange on the island. After his death, multiple churches and universities were interested in his book collection, but he had willed it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, providing that they purchase it for $300,000, which they did. Some of this history is hard to find online, but there are a couple of binders in the Great Hall that document much of it. Thorderson's personal papers are housed in the archives of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. All of this history is meant to provide some context for experiences I've had, directly or indirectly, on Rock Island. In August of 2021, I took my first and last trip there. After taking 2 ferry rides, I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I had booked the remote campsite E, a backpacking site a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery, and took a couple of breaks because of my heavy pack. I was definitely packed more for camping than for hiking. I reached my site, set up my tent, got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach for a fire. On my 3rd trip back from the beach, before I returned to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squeal coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual noise that I stopped in my tracks and waited a good 30 seconds to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I went back to my site and began getting a fire started. The remote sites on Rock Island are well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together, but there's probably 100 yards between each. There isn't a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked along the ridge that there's an obvious path. As I was arranging sticks in my fire ring, something caught my eye. Fairly far away, maybe near Site D or a bit farther, a person was running in my direction. My first thought was, that's odd, because there isn't really a proper trail there. Then I assumed something must be wrong and this person needed help. As they got a bit closer, I thought it might be a woman in loose gray clothes, maybe a hoodie, but the person was still too far away to see details. I quickly stood up from my crouching position, and just then, I heard that high-pitched squeal again. It was behind me, much closer this time. Startled, I turned around and scanned the trees for a few seconds but didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around, knowing the runner must be getting close, but now they were gone. I stood there, scanning the trees but saw no one. I was confused and froze for a few seconds. It was very strange, but I reasoned that it was just a fellow camper from Site C or D, maybe running to the pit toilet that was a couple 100 yards west of the sites. I tried to forget about it, but it bothered me. I really did not like that squeal, and it gave me a strange feeling. I forced myself to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of adult beverages, then decided to take a short walk. I hadn't seen Sites C or D yet, so I thought I would check them out and see if anyone was camping nearby. Site D was empty. I saw the path that led from that site to the main trail and pit toilet, which made me less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was someone from Site C who took a weird path. It still didn't make perfect sense, since I should have seen them, but it made me feel better. I continued to Site C, and saw there was a tent set up. I didn't want to bother anyone, but I decided to introduce myself as a neighbor from Site E, to see if anyone looked like the person I'd seen running. I walked up, and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither looked like the runner. I introduced myself. They introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s, very nice, and both seemed to be quietly drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or the squealing noise, thought it might be weird, so I just wished them a good night and headed back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark, and it started as a perfect night. The sky was clear, and the stars were brilliant. I felt better about the day and decided to get some sleep. It had been a long day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. Around 2:30 a.m., I was woken by a huge boom of thunder. It started pouring. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but not in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm rolled in, and I started to worry. The wind whipped at my tent and the ground shook from thunder and lightning. I felt very exposed out there in the tent. The storm lasted about an hour before becoming a light, steady drizzle. I was just starting to fall back asleep when I heard the squeal again. I opened my eyes wide in the dark, and lay there silently. There was another squeal, louder, and it was pretty close. I knew there were no truly dangerous animals on Rock Island, deer and porcupines, but no bears or wolves. But that knowledge didn't help. Something about that squeal unsettled me. I call it a squeal, because that's the best I can describe it. It sounded like a pig squeal. An injured or angry pig. I kept lying there and then heard footsteps outside my tent. It was still raining, so the sound was partially masked, but it definitely sounded like something somewhat large, an animal or a human, walking around. I sat up and pulled out a knife, just to feel better. In my head, I kept telling myself, "It's just an animal. There's nothing here that can hurt you." I listened as the footsteps moved away from my tent. I sat there, still holding the knife, for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. I started to think, "It's fine. It was just an animal. You're being silly and you need to sleep." I was about to lie back down when there was a very loud squeal right outside my tent. It felt like my heart stopped. A shiver went down my spine. My heart started pounding so hard that my entire body pulsed, and I felt it in my ears. It took all my courage, but I managed to force out, "Get out of here." I didn't shout, but I tried to sound as stern and threatening as I could. I heard no more squeals or footsteps that night, but I couldn't sleep. I sat there for about an hour, then lay down. Eventually the rain stopped, and I stayed there until the sun came up. I kept reassuring myself that I was being ridiculous, and it had to be an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. when I decided I had to step outside my tent. As soon as I did, I saw that my picnic table had been flipped upside down. Surprisingly, I felt calm and thought, "Okay, that's enough. I'm leaving the island today." I checked around and nothing else seemed out of place. I eventually reasoned that maybe the wind had blown the table over during the storm. It still seemed odd, given how heavy the table was, and that I didn't hear it flip. But that explanation made some sense. I made some cold instant coffee, had a bite to eat, and started to feel better about everything. Then I decided to go for a hike. I admit, I get easily scared when I'm camping alone in the woods. Maybe that's natural. But after having coffee and food and seeing the sun, I realized that nothing I'd seen or heard was outright unexplainable. Other than losing some sleep, I was still enjoying myself. The main reason I came to Rock Island was to hike the 7-mile Thorderson's Loop Trail, which has a lot of interesting sights. Close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it had to be a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like someone had recently used it. A little farther down the trail was a cemetery where 2 sisters and a few others are buried. It's believed there are more unmarked graves there, likely from the old fishing village. The island has 3 cemeteries, one by the beach where Chester Thorderson is buried, one on the eastern part of the island where the 2 sisters rest, and one on the northern part where the original lighthouse keeper, David E. Corbin, is buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial area on the island. though no one knows exactly where it is. I continued on the trail until I came to a scenic overlook with a bench. I sat down and drank some water. I started hearing voices on the trail ahead, though I couldn't see anyone yet. The trail bent, and the trees were thick, so I waited to see who would appear. As the voices got closer, I realized they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place the language. Both voices were very deep and guttural. Then, deeper in the woods, I heard a loud, quick rumble sound. Immediately, both of the voices responded with a higher-pitched rumble. I smiled a bit, thinking maybe they heard whatever it was and were playfully mocking it. I stood up, put on my backpack, and walked in their direction, but I never came across them. The rest of the hike was fine. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin is buried, took a self-guided tour of the Potawatomi Lighthouse, passed the wooden gate, apparently once part of a larger structure, walked by the Great Hall and the dock, visited some of the other structures, and saw Thorderson Cemetery. Then I finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a pleasant hike, with plenty to see, and not very difficult, though I was tired. I walked to Site C to ask the couple how they'd fared in the storm, but they had already left. I was disappointed because I really wanted to ask them if they'd heard the squealing noise. The rest of the evening was uneventful. I built a fire, made some meals, had a cigar and some drinks. As soon as it got dark, I was ready for bed after the previous night's lack of sleep. I got in my tent and fell asleep quickly. Maybe 3 hours later, I woke up suddenly, fully alert. Nothing seemed to have caused me to wake up, but I felt something was wrong. I sat up, and it's hard to explain, but a feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I've ever felt. It felt like there was something in the tent with me, and I could sense it was enraged, filled with anger and hatred for me. It felt like something terrible was about to happen, and I was powerless to stop it. I started shivering uncontrollably. There was a strong smell of garbage or rotten meat, growing so intense I thought I might vomit, but I was too frozen in fear to move. I had never felt so vulnerable. My mind seemed to accept that whatever was coming, even death, would at least be a relief. Then I blacked out. I assume I passed out, because the next thing I remember is waking up around 8 a.m. When I woke up, I was lying on top of my sleeping bag, not in it, and my legs were in an awkward position, my left leg straight, my right leg bent so my foot was against my left knee. My heart started pounding, but I kept telling myself, it was just a dream, I'm leaving right now. I packed everything quickly and made my way toward the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until about 10:30 a.m., I had some time to kill near the Great Hall and dock. I wanted off the island badly, but felt a bit calmer being out of the woods and seeing other people. I sat on a bench east of the dock and lit a cigar, just to occupy my mind and keep from thinking about the night before. After a few minutes I was startled by someone behind me saying, "Hi." I jumped, embarrassed, and the person came around saying, Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and came over to ask if you had a lighter." I felt dumb and told him I was just tired from not sleeping well. I handed him my lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, and gave the lighter back. We started chatting about normal things. He said he was from the Madison area, talked about the storms, and mentioned he was an outdoorsy guy with plans to move to Washington Island. It was a nice, normal conversation that took my mind off the night I'd had. He seemed like a decent person. Then naturally, he asked which site I'd been staying at. I told him Site E for the last 2 nights. He said he usually books Site E, but I must have reserved it before him, so he had booked Site D instead. I was surprised because I'd seen no tent or anything at Site D the 2 times I passed by. He explained that he comes to the island a few times a year, and while you have to reserve a site, he actually camps in different areas on the island. I asked where he camps and he said he usually camps in the East Cemetery, but also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail, then heads north into the woods and finds a spot to camp. He said that once he found the ruins of a small log house in those woods, and he wants to camp inside it someday. At this point, I started to reconsider him and wanted to change the subject. But then he asked if I had heard the screeches in the woods. I paused, knowing he meant the squealing I'd heard. I said yes, and asked if he knew what it was. He took a second to answer, and I saw his expression change, like he was deciding whether to share a secret. With no emotion in his voice, he said matter-of-factly, "A demon lives on this island." Under other circumstances I would have laughed it off, but not after my experience. He must have seen the anxiety and fear on my face, because he let out a quick laugh. He asked if I'd seen anything that night. I told him I hadn't, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt he knew I had experienced something. I wanted the conversation to end, but then he told me he saw something in the cemetery that night. His face and mood changed like he was going to confide in me. I really didn't want to ask what he'd seen, but I knew he wanted me to. So I asked, my voice shaky. I could tell he changed his mind about telling me. He looked at me with empathy and said what he saw was hard to explain, but if I was already afraid of the screeching, I shouldn't go near the cemetery. I didn't respond right away. Then he said 4 words, with no context. "Keepers of the flame." I looked at my cigar and saw the ash was long. I put it out, told him I was going to wait by the dock, and he nodded. As I walked away, he called, "Hey," and when I turned around, he just said, "Don't come back here." I don't know if that was a warning or a friendly suggestion, but I certainly wasn't planning to return to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame in connection with Rock Island. I found 3 possible references. The name Potawatomi can be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers were sometimes called Keepers of the Flame. And there was also a 19th century cult said to visit the island, calling themselves the same. I know hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year, and have a great time camping, hiking, and exploring Thordarson's buildings. My humble suggestion is this: do not go to Rock Island. I know I'm just a random person on Reddit, so there isn't any reason for you to take my word at face value. Nonetheless, I swear on the life of my family that every word is true. This is going to be a long post, but I want to be as detailed as possible about this event. I'm a 32-year-old man from, and currently living in, Cumberland County, New Jersey. This location puts me about 45 minutes away from Philadelphia and about 45 minutes away from the Atlantic Ocean, while being only about 15 minutes away from the Delaware Bay. After high school, I joined the Army as an intelligence analyst for a while. When I got out, I moved to New York City and worked as a project manager for a construction company until I met my wife. We decided to move back to New Jersey to be closer to our families, especially since she was pregnant with our daughter. That's just some background on me. This happened in October of 2018. It was about 11:45 at night, and I decided to sit on my front steps to smoke a couple of cigarettes before trying to fall asleep. Everyone else in the house was already sleeping. It was a pretty clear night, with not many clouds in the sky, but there was some fog on the ground. As I was smoking, I was looking at the fog, and to me, it seemed like there was movement in it. Almost as if there were invisible or camouflaged things out there that I wouldn't have seen if not for the fog. While watching the fog, I noticed a white truck that had driven by twice already. I could hear a man and a woman yelling at each other. The truck stopped at the stop sign in front of my house, and the woman got out screaming at the man, then slammed the door. He drove off fast, and she proceeded to walk into the woods across the street from me, which was strange because there's nothing back there except for blue holes until you reach the bay. If I walk straight out my front door, there are no houses or civilization. Only trees and those artificial lakes, blue holes, left over from sand plants, until you hit the Delaware Bay. About 5 minutes after the woman walked into the woods, things went from weird to absolutely, unbelievably scary and strange. The most reality-shattering event that has ever happened to me. I was still looking at the movement I'd been seeing in the fog when I heard a very loud noise coming from the woods. It sounded like metal being ripped apart. There isn't a good comparison for this sound because it was so unearthly. I'm sure it wasn't natural. That sound lasted about 10 to 15 seconds, then abruptly stopped and was replaced by another noise, which I felt more than I heard. Imagine being aware of a huge sound happening near you, but it's at a frequency your ears can't quite pick up. That's the best way I can describe it. This sound remained constant through the rest of the experience. At this point, I'll probably lose some people. And I know how crazy this sounds. But as I was getting used to the sound, it felt like something reached out to me mentally, without words, conveying a feeling of calm and a heads up, or warning about what was about to happen. It felt as if it was checking my reaction to what I was currently experiencing, like a security check. While I felt this sense of calm, I noticed a light in the sky that seemed to have risen out of the woods, maybe 5 or 6 miles away. It was just a ball of light in the distance, but somehow, I knew it was coming toward me, even though it wasn't moving very fast. Right after noticing the light in the sky, I got more freaked out than I have ever been in my life. In the woods across the street from me, no more than 50 yards away, these orbs of light started to appear. I could see some flicker into existence. They were all white lights, which didn't illuminate the area around them as you would expect from flashlights. There were probably 12 to 16 of these orbs, and they moved in a totally smooth manner. Besides the trail to get into the woods, the area is dense and filled with thorn bushes, so it just wouldn't be possible for people to move where these lights were moving, let alone do it so smoothly. I'm positive they weren't people with flashlights because of the terrain and the characteristics of the orbs themselves. I watched the orbs move around for about a minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I looked back up at the sky and saw a craft coming practically right toward me, only about 1,000 yards away by that point. I was going back and forth between watching the orbs on the ground and the craft, which I could see more clearly now. It was flying very low, maybe only 3.5 to 4 stories off the ground. I could see the path it was taking, and it was going to pass in front of me at an angle where I'd see both underneath and the side at the same time. The craft was a single-story, dull black rectangle. From underneath, I could see that it was made of 3 smaller rectangular panels that fit together to form a larger rectangle. I very clearly saw these 3 panels. Estimating size is harder, but I'd say it was about 35 yards long and 20 yards across. Underneath, there were lights flashing in a pattern, cycling one way and then back the other way. In the moment, I thought the craft was signaling to the orbs on the ground. It made no sound at all. I only heard that same buzzing and humming noise that I felt more than I heard. While it was in front of me, it moved really slowly, at a speed I don't think a plane with normal propulsion could manage while staying airborne. I took my eyes off the craft for just a moment to look at the orbs again. And when I looked back up, the craft was gone. For whatever reason, seeing it vanish like that made the reality of what I was witnessing hit home. I got really scared, especially since my daughter, wife, and mom were all inside, no more than 50 feet from this craziness. So I went in and locked the doors. I felt I might have investigated further if it were just my life at risk, but I wasn't willing to take that chance with my family. I might have been paranoid at this point, but I felt like I was being watched for the next 2 hours. I didn't experience any lost time. The entire event happened over 20 to 30 minutes. Looking back on this event, I question what was going on with the white truck and the woman who walked into the woods at the beginning. I've also done some research and found that there are quite a few reports of people seeing a glimmer man in the woods, which makes me think of the movement I saw in the fog. Where I live is a very active area for UFO phenomena, which makes sense if something wanted access to major cities like Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore, and DC. What could be a better place to hide than almost inaccessible 1,000-foot deep lakes in the middle of the woods? I know this was a very long post, but I wanted to be thorough. I'd really like to hear what you all think about this, and if anyone has had a similar experience or knows somebody who has. I wake up before sunrise, same as always, and slip on my boots. There's a strange heaviness in the farmhouse air, but I chalk it up to early morning grogginess and push the feeling aside. Outside, Fog settles over the fields, blurring the boundary between our pastures and the foothills. Normally that view calms me, the hush before chores begin. But today, I can't shake the prickling sense that something is off. I head toward the barn to check the feed and water troughs. At first glance, everything looks normal. The cattle huddle together in the early morning chill, a light breeze stirring stray pieces of hay around my ankles. Still, my nerves are on edge. It's been months since the first cow disappeared with no explanation. You'd think time would soothe my anxiety, but the lack of answers only stirs it up more. I remember that awful morning, when we searched every hollow and ridge, hoping to find tracks or any sign of a struggle. Instead, all we discovered were those flattened circles in the grass, as if something massive had pressed down from above. And two vehicles, both inexplicably drained of gas, parked right by those eerie patterns. We told ourselves it had to be some kind of prank or a freak coincidence. But the memory still makes my teeth clench. I shake off the thoughts and get back to my chores. Counting heads, checking fence lines, making sure there haven't been any breakouts. The herd seems fine, and as the sun climbs, the fog rolls back to reveal the entire farm. I know every inch of this land by heart. I grew up on it. But lately, walking these fields unsettles me. Some nights, I circle the property 3 or 4 times to ensure everything's locked up. I tell myself it's just caution, but deep down, I recognize it as dread. After a brief talk with my husband, we decide to keep a close watch around the spot where the first cow vanished. It's near the property line, where a few ragged cedar posts and rusty wire mark our boundary. No recent vehicle troubles have cropped up, but I still find myself scanning the ground, half expecting to see those flattened impressions again. Nothing shows up, which somehow feels even more ominous, like the farm is holding back some vital clue. By midday, the sun is brutal, and the cows laze in the shade. I linger by the fence, scanning for any sign that might explain what happened. But it's quiet. Too quiet. Normally I'd savor a day free from trouble, but right now I'd give anything for a simple issue like a sick calf or a broken fence. At least those make sense and can be fixed. My husband waves me over from the far side of the field. The anxiety on his face mirrors my own, and neither of us needs words to say we're still haunted by all this. We finish chores in silence, each wondering how something so impossible could happen here, on land that was always our haven. Evening arrives, painting the sky with orange and pink streaks. I lug a bale of hay to the feeding area, mentally reviewing every theory I've heard: rustlers, sinkholes, mountain lions. None of it adds up. We never found footprints, tire tracks, or any trace of a culprit. It's as if that cow simply blinked out of existence. After dinner, I linger on the porch. The yard light casts a weak glow that fades into the dark fields beyond. My gaze drifts to the tree line. Normally the rustle of leaves at night is soothing, but tonight it sets my nerves on high alert. I can't shake the feeling something out there doesn't belong. Refusing to let fear win, I walk down the steps and stand in the driveway, peering into the dimness. My rational mind insists there's nothing out there, that it's just my imagination. Still, tension squeezes my chest, compelling me to check the horizon again and again. Finally, I force myself back inside, fighting the urge to stand guard till dawn. In the farmhouse, I try to unwind, but my thoughts spin in circles. How did that cow vanish so completely? And is whatever took it still around? When I climb into bed, I promise myself to stay vigilant, no matter how paranoid it makes me. Sometimes not knowing is its own special torment, and right now, I'm drowning in it. I'd been convincing myself we were fine, that the tension on the farm was just a leftover reaction from the first disappearance. But the moment my husband told me my favorite cow was missing, I felt a deeper dread sink in. I'd raised her from a calf, and she never strayed far, especially not from her own baby. Yet there was her calf, bleeding in helpless circles, no sign of its mother. My sister showed up soon after. She's the family's fearless one, always ready for a late-night drive or trekking through a thorny hollow to find a lost calf. Even she looked shaken when she arrived. We grabbed flashlights, piled into the truck with my husband, and spent hours scouring every corner of the property, wading through muddy creeks, climbing steep ridges, crawling under fences. Nothing. It was as though the cow had been lifted straight off the pasture. By evening, we were exhausted. My husband headed back toward the barn, thinking we might have overlooked something closer to home. My sister and I tackled the strip of woods between two fields. The in-between, we call it, because it's technically someone else's land jutting into ours like a mismatched puzzle piece. Rusted barbed wire runs along the boundary, but our cows sometimes push through weak spots if they're determined. We parked at the fence line as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the grass. My sister hesitated before climbing over, which is unusual for her. I tried to joke that she was getting squeamish, but my own voice sounded shaky. Eventually, she hauled herself over, and we pressed into the trees. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. Birds and leaves that should have been rustling were silent. An oppressive hush weighed on us. I called out my cow's name, half laughing at the notion she'd answer. My sister tried to speak, but her voice sounded muffled, like the air itself was resisting her words. She looked pale, struggling just to breathe. A few yards later we stopped cold. It felt like my nerves were humming with electricity. My sister gripped my arm, whispering that she couldn't even hear me clearly, though we were only inches apart. At the same time, I picked up on a low vibration, more pressure than sound. The shadows around us seemed to shift whenever I focused on them. Without really discussing it, we both knew we had to leave. My sister turned first, and I stumbled after her, slipping on damp leaves and tripping over hidden roots. The fence seemed miles away, as if the woods were stretching out to keep us there. By the time we finally saw the barbed wire, I was shaking, and my sister looked as white as a sheet. Crossing back onto our own field felt like gulping fresh air after nearly drowning. We stood there, catching our breath, neither of us willing to speak about what we'd just experienced. It was too bizarre, too heavy. All we knew was that these woods didn't want us inside, and we had 2 missing cows to prove it. Still no real explanation, only the horrible certainty that it was worse than we'd ever imagined. When we rejoined my husband, we skipped details about the suffocating atmosphere. We just told him we'd found no broken branches, no footprints, nothing. He looked grim. The sun was almost gone, and we knew better than to hang around those trees after dark. My sister decided to head home. I lingered in the yard, letting the dim light play tricks on my eyes while I stared at the distant tree line. Another cow was missing, and now we had first-hand evidence of something lurking in those woods, something that could still the forest itself. I promised myself I wouldn't stop digging until I found a real answer. If I didn't, we might lose more than just cattle. Even after I went inside, I couldn't settle. My mind kept circling back to the way those woods felt alive, as if the trees themselves had pushed us away. By the time I crawled into bed, the house was eerily silent. The usual nighttime murmurs of the farm, cows shifting, wind rattling the barn, only made me more uneasy. Every creak sounded menacing, every shadow threatening. I rose before dawn, not that I'd slept. I poured coffee and stared out the window at the dark fields. The orphaned calf was pacing near the fence, letting out sorrowful cries that tore at my heart. It looked weaker, and no matter how many times I looked away, I kept glancing back, praying for a mother that would never return. That morning, my husband and I gathered family, parents, siblings, cousins from down the road, hoping to devise a plan. They arrived shortly after sunrise, and though it felt strange to meet so formally, it reminded us how serious things had become. 2 cows missing, no leads, and a sense of dread clinging to our land. Everyone offered theories: thieves, predators, old folklore about lights dancing in the hollers, or people vanishing into the woods. Normally our family avoids ghost stories, but desperation was making us consider anything. By evening, I stood on the back porch, scanning the horizon for movement. It felt like the farm itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wanted to march straight to the fence again, but my legs refused. Whether it was fear or common sense, I don't know. I pretended I'd try to sleep. Inside, I checked every door and window, again and again, peering into the yard light's glow. The darkness beyond seemed endless, and my heart hammered, half expecting to catch sight of something slipping across the pasture. I hated feeling so powerless in a place I once loved. Eventually, I forced myself to sit in the dark living room, letting my eyes adjust. Was it foolish to keep poking around, knowing something dangerous might be out there? But I couldn't just let it be. 2 missing cows and the stifling menace in the woods were reason enough to keep searching. I resolved that in the morning, I'd rope in more help if I had to. No more tiptoeing around. Even if it meant heading back into those trees with nothing but flashlights and a good dose of fear, I needed real answers. I must have dozed off at some point, only to jerk awake at a distant rumble. Thunder maybe, or something else. I never heard any storm. My pulse thundered as I scanned the living room shadows. Eventually, I whispered a few calming words to myself and curled tighter under a blanket. Dawn felt impossibly far away. Yet by sunrise, the farm looked almost serene. The calf lay still, its energy draining by the hour. I gathered supplies for another search, a mixture of determination and dread boiling in my stomach. This land, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battlefield, and I was tired of waiting for the next strike. I tried to imagine what might solve the mystery. Maybe we'd find a hidden ravine or a gap in the fence. Or maybe the truth was darker than any of us dared guess. Either way, I was ready to face it, for the farm's sake, and for ours. Never did I expect I'd walk away from this property. It's been in my family for generations, a site of summer picnics and lively cattle auctions, a piece of land I believed would always be mine. But these last few days changed everything. It started that morning, right after we agreed on one final search of the woods. My sister, my husband, and I prepared like we were heading into hostile territory. Flashlights, boots, walking sticks. We didn't talk much. We knew it was risky, maybe foolish. But we also knew we needed closure. We crossed the fields at first light, dew soaking our pants. The missing cow's calf followed us to the fence, bleeding mournfully. It was losing weight and stumbling, and I wished I could do more than leave extra feed. Yet we had to see if anything in those woods could explain how 2 cows had vanished. Stepping over the barbed wire felt like entering another world. The air was thick, the trees unnaturally tall, and the forest floor strangely quiet. My sister led with her flashlight, cutting a path through brambles. My instincts screamed this was a terrible idea, but none of us wanted to be the first to back out. The farther we went, the more we noticed faint pops, like distant static echoing through the trees. At first, we saw no real clues. No animal remains, no footprints, no sign of disturbance. But the sense of being watched wouldn't let up. Then we stumbled on a small clearing where the leaves were scorched in a neat circle, as though blasted by intense heat. My sister felt a charge in the air and backed away. My husband and I stepped closer, but we found only charred leaves and a suffocating heaviness that made it hard to breathe. We stayed longer than we should have, flashlights moving in jittery arcs, our hearts thudding in our ears. The silence grew crushing. Not a single bird or breeze to break it. We shared a look that said we had to leave immediately. Turning to go, we realized the trees seemed to have shifted, as if blocking our way out. My husband moved first, flashlight trembling in his grip, until a sharp crack of a branch froze us in place. The shadows seemed to pulse. My sister urged us onward, so we pushed through the brush, trying not to panic with each step. I've heard stories about people seeing horrifying shapes or floating lights in the wilderness, but we never glimpsed anything solid. Instead, it was the pervasive sense of something closing in. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, but there was nothing to see. It felt like we were being guided, or herded, out. I kept checking over my shoulder, terrified one of us would vanish if I looked away too long. Stumbling back out onto our own land was a shock, like bursting through the surface after being underwater. We gasped for air, and the sunlight felt unnaturally bright. My sister almost collapsed, and my husband steadied her. We all stared at the tree line, expecting to see a figure lurking, but there was only the still wall of trees. We made our decision right then. No debate, no argument. We hurried to the house, hearts hammering and legs weak. Even in broad daylight, everything seemed ghostly. After a rushed talk, we agreed we couldn't stay, waiting for the next disappearance, or the next moment of sheer terror. The farm had become a place of dread. The rest of the day was a blur. Packing our essentials, calling family, arranging for the remaining cattle. Nobody opposed our plan. Most admitted they too felt the looming threat. A few relatives stayed behind long enough to sell or move the herd. Walking away from generations of family history cut deep, but not as deeply as facing whatever was in those woods. By sunset, my sister, my husband and I were in our vehicles, driving off in a small convoy. We didn't dare look back at the house or fields we had once cherished. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and a voice in my head warned me not to glance in the rearview mirror, afraid I'd see something I could never forget. We barely spoke on that drive, but our unspoken promise was clear. We weren't coming back. Fear, survival instinct, whatever you want to call it, we had reached our limit. That old farm could keep its secrets. Whatever lurked there had claimed the land for itself, and we were done fighting. I don't know if anyone else will ever set foot on that property, or if future owners will discover what lies hidden in those trees. All I know is that we left, alive but shaken, searching for any peace we could find. Maybe these memories will fade someday, but right now, I still feel the echo of that oppressive silence, and I have no intention of letting it drag me back. I must preface this with a few things. This encounter is secondhand, but it was told to me on multiple occasions by the person who experienced it. I am a natural skeptic and cynic, so I can't say I 100% believe it. However, his telling of the story was simple yet concise, and it never varied between retellings. I've known him for many years, and his advice and input on just about everything are well-reasoned and always helpful, so I'll take his word for it, even if with a grain of salt. Also keep in mind I am not a seasoned writer. My past and present tenses may get a little jumbled, but I'll keep it as clear and accurate as I can. Now, let's get down to business. My friend, we'll call him Marv, likes to go solitary camping on occasion to be one with nature and experience everything that goes along with that. He's also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said this took place, but it was a few years back when he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear and a few guns, a hunting rifle and a .45 sidearm specifically, and headed out into the country onto a vast swath of property owned by a friend of his. He had full permission and the works. This happened near the Kisatchie National Forest in south-central Louisiana. I won't be any more specific than that. Suffice it to say, it's miles and miles of forest and wilderness. He liked to hike in pretty deep and camp at a specific spot he had found on a few previous trips. These details are sparse, as they're not really the meat and potatoes of this encounter. After making his way in, he set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was late afternoon, when he heard leaves crunching and twigs snapping. He assumed it was an animal at first and got up from cooking something on the fire to take a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise, and saw a man approaching through the trees, still a good many yards away. Marv has described his etiquette for dealing with people in very remote places as always being cautious because more often than not, the people he comes across are armed, just like him. He tries to stay friendly while keeping his guard up, always on the lookout for ulterior motives, because you never know what some folks are up to in the middle of nowhere. He'll make small talk with them, find out generally what they're doing if he can, and occasionally share a meal. He's never really met anyone nefarious until this situation, and maybe one other, but that's a whole other ordeal. One thing that set off small alarm bells for him was that he knew he was the only one with permission to be on this property. Secondly, the guy was not dressed for this location at all. He said the man was wearing a white t-shirt, short blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Keep in mind, Marv was miles out in the middle of the woods, away from any paths, roads, houses, or anything else. Nobody would casually stroll into that location dressed like that unless they were lost or confused. It was early fall, but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana. So there were tons of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects aplenty. You wouldn't want most of your skin exposed if you could help it, especially deep in the woods. I know that all too well from personal experience. Marv assumed something might be off and called out, "Hey there, do you need help or something?" Loudly, definitely loud enough to be heard. The man kept walking forward, staring directly at him. Marv started to feel uneasy, which is unusual for him because he's typically cool as a cucumber in tense situations. As the man kept closing the distance, Marv stood up and said loudly, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" The guy was now about 15 to 20 feet away from Marv, standing at the edge of the clearing and the forest. Looking Marv dead in the eye, the man spoke clearly. "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to get worried at this point because the way the man said it made it seem like something that didn't quite know how to talk. At least, that was his first impression. It didn't sound right. The man, still unmoving, said, "Help me," again. Slightly more emphatic, but only slightly louder. Marv said that's when he picked up on what was really wrong. He noticed the timbre of the voice was more feminine, and actually sounded like a recording being played back. The man's lip and mouth movements weren't matching the words. It was as if he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase, then closing it again. Marv asked, "What do you need help with?" Not daring to back up or move at all. The man, still standing motionless, still looking directly at Marv, said, "Help me," again, and repeated the phrase another 3 times slowly, but not any louder. Now, completely unsure of what the hell was going on, Marv interrupted him by barking, "All right, you need to go now, unless you actually need my help." He continued, loud and firm, "Do you need my help or not?" The man didn't miss a beat. He started up with the "help me" again and made as if to take another step toward Marv. Marv told me he did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He drew his .45 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the man, telling him again, "You need to go, I don't care what you want." The man grew more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder and louder, but he neither stepped closer nor backed away. Marv did what he thought was right, given his predicament. Assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, he discharged a round into the ground in front of the man. Here's where it gets fully absolutely crazy. I'm not kidding. The man stopped uttering the phrase, went silent, and while still staring at Marv, did a full backflip somersault, the kind gymnasts do, backward into the woods, disappearing immediately from sight. Yes, you read that right. I know what you're thinking because I had, and still have, the same reaction. That sounds like bullcrap. But Marv gave no indication of lying, and told me this story multiple times, every time in a dead serious manner. Marv said the man backflipped away effortlessly, as if pulled by an unseen tensioned coil. He described it as completely unnatural and totally out of place. The man had just appeared, repeated the same phrase over and over, and became almost frantic before Marv fired at the ground in front of him, causing him, or it, to flee. Marv stood there, focused on the spot in the forest where the man had vanished. He saw and heard no further movement. It was as if the guy had never been there at all. He stayed like that as the sun began to set, and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is pretty unshakable, and actually stayed in the area for the rest of that night and the next, with no further incident. When he told me and some other friends about this, of course we had many questions. We asked him to elaborate on the man's speech. He said the more he thought about it afterward, the more sure he was that it was definitely a female voice coming from the man. It was like he, or it, had heard someone say, "Help me," and was mimicking it like a parrot or some other talking bird, almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wanted. It didn't give any indication that it wanted Marv to follow, or do anything else. It reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what followed. Marv has been back to the property since, with no other strange occurrences. The only other small detail I can think of is that during the early morning of that first night, he remembered hearing what sounded like a gunshot in the distance. It sounded eerily similar to his .45. He thought he might have heard it again on his hike back out. Of course, there are people who hunt in the area, so it could have just been that. He couldn't be sure. Since this incident, and one other, which happened in a completely different location, Marv has done some online research of the whole Kisatchie area, and found many legends, stories, and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers, and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the region. Not to mention mimics, and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounter lines up with these tales. There's nothing tangible to prove it, of course, but even as a skeptic, it makes me wonder about strange things in remote and untouched areas of our world that can't be explained. I've lived in Southern California my entire life. If you know anything about California, you'll know it's very diverse. Up north, it's filled with mountains and trees, while down south it's much more city-like. This summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and it was my first time being upstate. I'm going to chop this story up into segments to make it an easy read. Day 1. I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. After an 8-hour drive, I was very tired. I went and lay down in the bed in the loft. It was quiet, like being in a different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside my house. But here, it was silent. I fell asleep fairly quickly. About 4 hours later, I jerked awake. I looked around for a bit before hearing a strange tapping sound. I tried to figure out where it was coming from, but to no avail. It sounded as if someone was tapping on the window of the back door. I figured I was just paranoid and fell back asleep. Day 2. Nothing happened this day and I slept fine. Day 3, early morning. I woke up very early, maybe around 4 a.m. I heard a crash coming from the attic ladder, which was conveniently placed right behind the couch I was sleeping on. I didn't move. Then I heard a few footsteps. You know that feeling when you sense someone staring at you? That's exactly how I felt. I was on my side, staring straight ahead. Suddenly I felt somebody, or something, crawl over me. I felt 2 hands on either side of me, and I could tell their face was just inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead, and I wasn't about to turn my head to see who, or what, it was. It felt like they stayed there forever before finally crawling backward and off the couch. I heard the dog let out a muffled bark, and then someone shushed her with a quiet, "Good girl." The presence lingered for what felt like an eternity, until I heard footsteps going out the back door. Still, I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep. Later, when I felt it was safe, I checked on my friends. None of them had left their rooms that night. When I told them what happened, they said I was just being paranoid. I half agreed, and we went on with our day as planned. Day 3. Later that day. After a day at the lake with my friends, we returned to a quiet, cozy cabin. The caretakers told us there was a river a bit farther into the woods, about a 15-minute walk. My friends decided to stay behind and rest, so I took some bug spray, a small backpack with snacks, and my phone, and headed out. The trail was pretty straightforward. Tall grass flanked either side, and the path itself was thin, but easy to follow. I reached the riverbank where there were 2 picnic tables. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, but I'd stupidly worn sandals. I dropped my bag on one of the tables and started back toward the cabin. For some odd reason, the path suddenly seemed distorted. What was once a smooth trail was now rough and uneven. I noticed the tall grass on the side of the path had been flattened, as if something huge, and I mean gigantic, had passed through it. At first, I suspected a bear, since the locals warned us they could be a problem this time of year. But the sheer size of whatever caused it made me second-guess that. I was startled, but kept going until I made it back to the cabin, and then I returned to the river again. By now, I was a little frightened. I kept telling myself I was just overreacting and should try to enjoy nature. I sat at one of the tables and watched the river for a while. That's when I started to feel like something was watching me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was trying to prank me, but there was no one. Across the river, I noticed some disturbed brush. It opened into a small clearing, blocked off by two logs in an X shape. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden behind that thick brush. Hoping to find some sign of life, I moved down to the river's edge. But there was nothing. No fish, no frogs, no roads. Just mosquitoes. A whole swarm of them. Disappointed, I went back to the table. That's when I heard it. A sound I can't accurately describe. Like a scream mixed with a gurgle. As if whatever was making the noise had a mouthful of water. It was inhuman. I froze. I should have run for my life, but I just stood there. I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. Yes, the same bushes I'd been worrying about earlier. And then that scream again, even louder this time. It was the loudest sound I've ever heard. Run. So I did. I sprinted through the forest, but what should have been a quick run back to the cabin turned into anything but. After about 10 minutes of full-on sprinting, I realized I was lost. I stopped for a moment, panicking, to see if anything looked familiar. Finally, I spotted a bridge I remembered crossing on my way there. I started running toward it, wondering why that thing hadn't just attacked me when I first froze. That thought haunted me. I could hear it chasing me. It felt like a twisted game. Every time I stopped, it stopped too. Eventually, I made it back to my cabin. Instead of going inside, I stood on the porch facing the forest and cried. I couldn't see anything unusual out there, but I knew it was there. I didn't want to turn my back on it, so I stayed on the porch for hours, silently crying, checking my phone occasionally, and writing all of this down. I still don't know what that thing was. The only creature I can compare it to is a wendigo or skinwalker. All I know is that I will never go back to that river again. If anyone has insight into what or who might have been out there, I'd appreciate it. These past 2 days have been too strange not to be connected. Edit. Last day of the trip. We burned some sage before heading to bed that night. Brett came to me around 4 a.m. and said he couldn't sleep. We watched TV for a while before hearing tapping on the back window again. It lasted a few seconds at a time, almost in intervals, if that makes sense. Brett managed to record a video. We decided not to investigate because, frankly, we were scared out of our minds. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. Brett and I took turns sleeping, and nothing else happened that night, until we were both woken by loud banging on the shed out back. When we went to check it out, no one was there. I'm leaving in 2 hours. I can't wait to get back to city life and leave all this weirdness behind. Thank you for all your support and guidance over these past few days. I really appreciate it, and wish you all the best. The mornings here are quiet, usually very quiet. Silence that stretches, yawns, and swallows sound whole. No birds, no wind, just the soft creak of the cabin settling in the cool September air. That morning wasn't any different, at least not at first. Bo was scratching at the door like usual, his way of saying, "Walk now, or deal with me later." I grabbed his leash, threw on my boots, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, crisp enough to wake me up faster than coffee. We started our walk along the edge of the property, where the pines press in on one side and the wheat field sprawls out on the other. Bo always loved this route, nose to the ground, tail wagging like he was on the trail of something big. But today, he was different. His nose stayed up, ears twitching at every rustle in the field. His steps weren't playful. They were cautious, deliberate. It put me on edge, even if I didn't want to admit it. The wheat was high that year, taller than me in some spots. I hated it. Couldn't see a damn thing past the first couple rows, and it always felt like something was just out of sight, watching. Bo stopped, his body stiff. His growl started low, the kind that made your stomach knot up, the kind that said, "We're not alone." "Coyotes probably," I muttered, trying to convince myself as much as him. But coyotes didn't usually make Bo act like this. He pulled at the leash, digging his paws into the dirt like he wanted to drag me straight into the wheat. "Knock it off, Bo," I said, yanking him back. His growl turned into a bark, sharp and urgent. Then I heard it, a soft whimper, high-pitched, like a puppy crying out for help. It came from the wheat. I froze. There weren't any dogs around here that I knew of. No neighbors for miles. The sound came again, closer this time. Probably some stray, I said, though it sounded more like a question. I took a step forward, and Bo went wild, barking and pulling harder than ever. All right, I said, backing up. We're going. But as I turned to leave, the whimper changed. It stretched, warbled, like a record spinning too slow. And then it was something else entirely. A growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through my chest. Bo lunged at the wheat, his leash cutting into my hand. Bo, stop, I shouted, my voice cracking. The wheat rustled, a heavy sound like something big was moving through it. Not a dog, not a coyote, something bigger. I gripped Bo's leash tighter and pulled, practically dragging him back toward the cabin. The growl followed us, growing louder, sharper, and then it shifted again. This time it sounded human. A scream tore through the air, raw and ragged, like someone was being ripped apart. My feet moved faster than my brain could process, dragging Bo along as he barked and howled like he was trying to fight whatever was in that wheat. We reached the edge of the yard, and I glanced back just once. The wheat was still again, perfectly still, like nothing had ever been there. Bo stopped barking but kept growling, his eyes locked on the field. I didn't wait to see if anything came out. Inside the cabin, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. Bo paced in front of the window, still growling low. I grabbed the curtain and yanked it shut. No way was I looking out there again. That scream, though, it stuck. It didn't sound like an animal. Didn't sound like a person either. It sounded wrong. Like something trying to sound human and not quite getting it. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, Bo curled up at my feet. I thought about the field, about how still it had looked after all that noise. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild, just a stray dog or coyote. Then came the tapping on the window. Light at first, like a bird brushing against the glass. Then heavier, deliberate. I didn't move. Bo's head shot up, his ears twitching. He growled low, a sound so deep it rumbled through the floorboards. The tapping stopped. I sat there, every muscle locked up, staring at the curtain like it was going to be ripped off at any second. But nothing happened. The cabin stayed quiet, except for Bo's growl and the faint sound of wind whispering through the wheat. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little. I spent the morning cleaning up the scratches on my front door. Long, jagged marks that ran deep into the wood, like something with claws had tried to get in. Bo sat by the window, watching the tree line, growling under his breath. He hadn't been himself since the day near the wheat, and neither had I. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Every creak of the walls, every gust of wind against the glass had me glancing over my shoulder. I needed answers. Something had been out there, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. I called Walter, my nearest neighbor, if you could call someone living 3 miles down a dirt road a neighbor. He picked up on the third ring, his voice gruff like he'd been expecting bad news. "What's going on, Charlie?" I told him everything. The wheat, the scream, the tapping on the window. I even told him about the claw marks, though I could hear how ridiculous it all sounded as the words tumbled out. He didn't laugh, didn't tell me to get some sleep or lay off the whiskey. Instead, there was a long pause, followed by a quiet, "You need to come by." I packed Bo into the truck and headed over. The drive felt longer than usual, the pine trees pressing in on either side of the road like they were trying to swallow it whole. Even Bo was uneasy, his ears twitching at every sound. Walter was waiting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined like someone who'd spent too many years staring into the woods. He didn't say much, just waved me inside. His house was cluttered, walls lined with hunting trophies and old photographs. He poured us coffee and sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he lit another cigarette. "What you're dealing with," he started, "ain't something you can shoot or scare off. It's older than that. Old as the land itself. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Walter went on to tell me about a story he'd heard growing up. A legend passed down from the Ojibwe people who used to live on this land. They spoke of a guardian spirit, something tied to the woods and the fields. It wasn't evil, not exactly, but it didn't take kindly to being disturbed. They called it the Keeper, he said, his voice low. Said it watched over the land, made sure everything stayed in balance. But if you messed with it, dug up something you weren't supposed to, it'd come for you. That's when I remembered. The artifact. I told Walter about the carved piece of metal I'd found in the garden last week, how I'd tossed it near the edge of the field without thinking twice. His face darkened. You need to put it back, right where you found it, and you need to do it soon. I wanted to ask him why, wanted to push for more details, but something in his expression stopped me. Walter looked scared, the kind of fear that doesn't leave room for questions. On the drive home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I thought about the artifact, the weight of it in my hand, the strange carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the light. I'd found it buried deep, almost like it wasn't supposed to see daylight. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was nearly dark. The cabin loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly against the growing night. Bo bolted out of the truck and ran straight to the porch, his tail down, ears flat. The air felt wrong, too still, too quiet. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the spot near the field where I'd left the artifact. The wheat was swaying, though there wasn't any wind. My footsteps crunched against the dirt path, louder than they should have been. The artifact was still there, half buried where I'd tossed it. I crouched down, picking it up gingerly. It felt colder than I remembered, heavier. The carvings on its surface seemed deeper now, more intricate, like they'd grown in my absence. As I stood, a sound carried through the air, a low, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting. It wasn't coming from the house or the woods. It was coming from the field. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight into the wheat. The light barely penetrated the stalks, but the sound grew louder, closer. Bo barked from the porch, a sharp, desperate sound that made me want to run. But I couldn't move. The wheat shifted, parting slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of something moving within. Tall, too tall, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. The hum turned into a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground. I bolted. The artifact clutched in my hand. I ran back to the cabin with Bo barking wildly at my heels. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood as the sound outside faded. Inside, Bo wouldn't settle. He paced the room, whining and growling at the windows. I set the artifact on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might move on its own. Walter's words echoed in my head. You need to put it back, and you need to do it soon. The chanting outside stopped, replaced by a single deliberate knock on the door. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. The knock on the door had been deliberate, too deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, wasn't done with me. Bo lay by the door, growling low, his ears flicking at every creak of the cabin. The artifact sat on the kitchen table, cold and silent, as if it was waiting for me to decide what came next. Walter's warning played over and over in my head. I had to put it back. Not toss it, not leave it near the edge of the field like I did before, but back where it came from. The problem was, I couldn't even be sure I'd survive the trip. By the time the sun began creeping over the trees, I was already packed. A flashlight, my hunting knife, and a bundle of matches I wasn't sure I'd ever use. Bo whined when I leashed him, but I had no intention of bringing him into the field. He stayed on the porch, pacing and barking as I headed toward the wheat alone. The early light stretched long shadows over the rows of wheat, making the field look taller, denser. Every step I took along the dirt path felt like walking into a trap. The silence wasn't natural, not the kind you hear when the woods are still waking up. This was something else. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, suffocates you. I stopped where I thought I'd dug up the artifact the first time. The wheat swayed around me, though the air was completely still. Clutching the artifact in one hand, I crouched, my knife in the other, and started digging. The ground was cold and stubborn, resisting me at every scrape of the blade. That's when it started again. The sound. A low, rhythmic hum, so deep it felt like it was coming from beneath the ground. I froze, my hands caked with dirt, my heart hammering. The hum built slowly, shifting into something sharp and grating, like metal scraping against bone. The wheat rustled to my left, then to my right. Something was moving, circling, but I couldn't see it. I kept digging, throwing dirt behind me as fast as I could, desperate to finish before whatever was out there decided to come closer. And then it stopped. The sound, the movement, the wheat stood perfectly still. I didn't dare look up. The soil beneath my knife began to soften, almost too easily, as though something below wanted me to hurry. My blade hit something hard, and I realized I'd found the spot. The hole was deeper now, more than enough to bury the artifact, but I hesitated. A part of me felt like putting it back was a trap. Like whatever I was dealing with wanted me to finish this for reasons I didn't understand. The wheat shifted behind me. Slow, deliberate. I clenched the artifact so tightly the edges dug into my skin. My flashlight flickered, casting long beams that made the shadows stretch and twist. I stood, turning slowly, and finally saw it. It wasn't just one. Tall figures stood just inside the wheat, their forms barely visible between the stalks. They didn't move like they had before, jerky and unnatural. Now their motions were fluid, almost human, but there was nothing human about them. Their limbs were too long, bending in ways that defied reason. And their faces, if they could even be called faces, were pale voids, featureless, except for faint impressions where eyes might have been. They didn't advance. They just watched, their heads tilting in unison, as though waiting for me to act. I dropped the artifact into the hole and shoved the dirt over it, my hands trembling. The hum started again, but it wasn't coming from the ground anymore. It was coming from them. A deep, layered sound that vibrated in my chest and made my ears ache. "I'm sorry," I said, though my voice felt small and useless. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." The figures didn't react. The hum grew louder, sharper, like it was burrowing into my skull. I backed away slowly, careful not to trip, careful not to run. The wheat began swaying violently, as if caught in a storm, but the figures stayed still, their heads following my every step. I reached the edge of the field and turned, bolting toward the cabin. The hum stopped the moment I crossed into the yard, but the silence that followed was even worse. Bo barked and howled, his claws scrabbling at the porch as I climbed the steps and collapsed against the door. My lungs burned, my hands throbbed, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Inside, I locked the door and pushed the kitchen table in front of it. Bo sat at my feet, whining softly as I tried to steady my breathing. For a moment, everything was still. No hum, no movement, just the faint sound of wind through the trees. But then came the tapping. Not at the windows this time, not at the door. It came from the roof, slow, deliberate, moving steadily toward the center of the cabin. They weren't gone. They were never gone. I think my friend and I are being followed by a skinwalker. This started a few days ago. I don't know what we did, but ever since about 3 days ago, we've been noticing very odd things. Our truck started smelling like sulfur and rotten meat, and our trailer, which is very clean, smells like rotten meat as well. We don't have any meat here. We checked. We hear scratching at night while we're trying to sleep, as well as knocking. But that doesn't make sense because we are in the middle of nowhere in Utah, with no towns for at least 20 miles. There is also a Native American reservation literally 200 feet from our property. We decided to go looking for it last night. We walked about 2 miles from our truck and started to smell sulfur. Then we both saw a 6 or 7 foot tall silhouette running toward us. We ran right back to the truck, but it wouldn't start. Pretty cliché, I know. I got out, went to the toolbox on the side, grabbed a wrench, and started taking off the intake. I sprayed some ether in and put the intake back on, and it fired up. Needless to say, we peeled out of there. We were doing about 53 miles per hour heading back to our trailer when I looked back and saw that thing still behind us and keeping up. I told my buddy to punch it because it was right behind us. He floored it, but it wouldn't go any faster. It can usually do around 70-80, but it wouldn't go past 55. It's a Ford 6.9 IDI with a turbo kit, in case anyone was wondering. We eventually made it the mile or so back to our trailer, shut the truck off, and ran inside as fast as we could. We locked the door and covered all the windows with blankets. As soon as I got the last blanket up, there was something tugging at our door and trying to open it, so I went and held the door shut. Then, out of nowhere, the lock started to unlock itself. I tied it in the locked position with a bootlace, grabbed a hammer, it's all I had to defend myself, and waited. About a minute later, I got a text from a girl I'm interested in, but who never texts me back, saying that she's in trouble and needs us to come get her right now. I asked what was going on, and she said she was getting kicked out of the house. So I got ready to go because this was my only chance with her. I asked if she had money for diesel, and she asked me why. I told her we were coming to get her, and she then said, "Why would I want to see you? We haven't talked in months." What? You just texted me 3 minutes ago. So I decided it was probably in our best interest to stay inside that night. I started hearing my name being called from outside by vaguely familiar voices, but I couldn't quite place them. I never looked outside last night for fear that this thing was just outside the door. I put salt around the door because someone told me that would help, and nothing got in last night, so it must have worked. Now it's morning, and there's almost no sign that anything happened last night. No scratch marks on the trailer, no dents, no footprints or paw prints, nothing. So here I am writing this and hoping someone believes me because I need help. I don't know how to get rid of this thing. If you read this far, I just want to say thank you, and I will have another update tonight. To clarify, this post is not me trying to seek attention. I'm just saying I'm scared to death and don't know what to do. There are people saying that it's fake, but I'm just explaining the events that happened and asking for help. I appreciate those of you who are trying to help me and keep me safe. Unfortunately, I cannot leave my property since I have nowhere else to go, but I am taking the necessary precautions to stay safe. I'm going to the gas station soon to buy salt to make a barrier around my trailer. Thanks for the help, y'all. Again, feel free to downvote my post if you like. All I need is help. I understand the skepticism, I really do, as I didn't think it was real either. The thing that really shook me was when the door started to shake and began to unlock. Thanks for reading. Edit 2. Another thing I forgot to mention is that my flashlight did flicker on and off a few times. I don't know if that's paranormal or just the battery dying, but I thought I should mention it. Edit 3, Day 4. It's now nighttime, and I haven't experienced anything yet today. I plan on keeping a log of everything that happens. The reason it says Day 4 is because this whole thing started about 4 days ago. Even though it's dark, I really want to capture some video for everyone, and that's what I'll be doing. I'm not going to try to piss it off, but I am going to record. Not sure how I'll upload it yet, but I'll find a way and be back with an update. Thanks again to everyone who is genuinely trying to help me. Ever since I followed your advice, I've had fewer experiences, but that could just be because it was daytime. Also, side note, I went to the reservation today, but no luck. My buddy and I asked everyone who drove by where the tribe is, and nobody knew. We might have to try again tomorrow. I wish I could just call them, but I don't know where to find their number. I'll be back with an update in a couple of hours, hopefully. Edit 4, Day 5. I listened to everyone's advice and made a salt barrier. There are also a lot of people saying that it's a demon, not a skinwalker, so I've been researching demons. I found one very helpful point. If you don't give it the power to mess with you, you won't get messed with. So I did exactly that last night. I didn't focus on it. In fact, y'all told me to pray, so I prayed. I didn't hear any knocking or scratching last night. No light flickering, nothing. Thank you to everyone who has helped me fight off this entity, whatever it is. You guys don't understand how much you helped me stay calm and fight it off. Also, if I do have any more experiences, I will try to record it and communicate with it using an EVP app. Not sure if the app works, but I might as well try. Thanks again, y'all. I'll be back with an update later. Edit 5, and most likely final update. No new occurrences. I still haven't gotten any help from the reservation, but nothing has happened in the last couple of days. We also got a dog, and it hasn't acted weird at all these last couple of days. I think that whatever was bothering us is gone for good. I just want to say, I'm so glad I had y'all to help me through this, and keep me calm. I may or may not post more updates, depending on what happens next. I should have trusted my gut the moment I stepped into that house. It wasn't just the damp smell that hit me like a slap. Mold, old wood, and something faintly metallic, like pennies left out in the rain. It wasn't even the dim lighting that turned every corner into a shadowy void. No, it was the feeling. That heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on me as soon as I crossed the threshold, like the house was watching me. I knew something wasn't right, but I told myself to man up. We were here because we had no other choice. Mission rules didn't matter when you didn't have a roof over your head. The woman who owned the place, Sister Wilcox, waddled ahead of us, her wide frame brushing against the walls as she led us to our room. She didn't say much, just muttered something about us making do. Her voice was thin and raspy, like the air in the house. When she opened the door to our room, I had to bite back a grimace. Room was generous. It was more like a shoebox someone had lined with cheap paneling and called livable. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light. 2 twin beds, crammed together with barely enough space to walk between them, and a closet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "This'll do," she said, more to herself than to us. Her small, watery eyes flitted over me, lingered for a beat too long, then turned to my companion, Elder Russo. "Dinner's at 6, she added before lumbering off, her footsteps heavy on the creaky floorboards. "Cozy," Russo muttered, tossing his bag onto one of the beds. His Italian accent made everything sound less sarcastic than it probably was. I tried to shake off the unease as I unpacked, telling myself this was temporary. Just a few days until the mission office found us another place. But the feeling lingered, a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. The first night, I couldn't sleep. Russo snored softly on the bed next to mine, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. But something kept me awake. Maybe it was the faint creak of the house settling, or the way the shadows in the corner seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stared at the closet door, its faded wood grain catching the light in strange patterns. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of my name. David. It was a whisper, soft but distinct. My eyes snapped open and my heart hammered in my chest. I glanced at Russo, who was still snoring, then at the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. "David." It came again, this time louder, more insistent. My skin prickled and my mouth went dry. I told myself it had to be my imagination, a leftover thread from a half-remembered dream. But the voice didn't sound like something conjured by my subconscious. It sounded real, close, like someone standing just behind the closet door. I sat up, my movements slow and deliberate, and stared at the crack of darkness inside the closet. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Russo," I whispered. No response. I reached over and shook his shoulder, but he just grunted and rolled over. The voice didn't come again that night, but I didn't sleep. I sat there, wide-eyed, watching the closet until the first light of dawn seeped through the window. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Stress, fatigue. But when Russo asked why I looked like I hadn't slept, I couldn't bring myself to tell him. What would I even say? That I thought the closet was whispering to me? We spent most of the day out on our bikes, visiting houses, knocking on doors. By the time we got back, I was bone tired, the kind of exhaustion that made your legs feel like lead. But as soon as we stepped into that house, the unease came rushing back. Dinner was the same bland casserole as the night before, served with Sister Wilcox's unsettling stare. She didn't talk much, but when she did, It was always something strange. Cryptic comments about how houses have memories, and some rooms are better left shut. That night, I made sure the closet door was shut tight before I climbed into bed. I even jammed a chair against it just to be safe. Russo teased me for it, but I didn't care. "You'll thank me when the boogeyman doesn't get us," I said, forcing a laugh. But the laugh died in my throat when I woke up in the middle of the night to find the chair moved and the closet door wide open. The voice was back, clearer this time. "David, come here." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight, a sense of command that made my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, to wake Russo, but I couldn't move. It was like something had pinned me to the bed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the open door. The darkness inside seeming deeper than it should have been. Like it wasn't just shadows, but something alive, watching me. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. When I finally managed to move, I didn't dare look inside the closet. I just reached over and shook Russo awake. "We're switching beds," I blurted. "What? Why?" he grumbled, groggy and annoyed. "Just trust me." He didn't argue, and I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. By the third night, I was ready to leave, rules be damned, but Russo convinced me to stick it out. "A few more days," he said. "We can handle a few more days." That was the night I woke up to find the scratches, 3 long parallel lines across my abdomen. They didn't bleed, but they burned like fire. I stumbled to the bathroom, my hands shaking as I stared at them in the mirror. They were too precise, too clean, not something I could have done to myself. When I asked Sister Wilcox the next morning if she had any pets, her response sent a chill through me. "No pets," she said, smiling faintly. "But you know this house is haunted, don't you?" She didn't wait for my reply. She just shuffled off, humming to herself, leaving me alone with the gnawing realization that whatever was in this house wasn't done with me yet. The reservation felt like another planet. The air was thinner, drier, and the emptiness stretched forever. Rusted-out cars littered yards like forgotten relics, and the wind carried a faint, metallic tang that didn't belong to the desert. My new companion, Elder Ramirez, was the quiet type. He was polite enough, but you could tell he'd seen some things in his 5 months here. The kind of things he didn't want to talk about. "We stick to the rules here," he told me the first day. "No staying out past sundown, no shortcuts through the back roads. And if something feels wrong, we leave. No questions." It sounded dramatic, but I didn't argue. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't quoting the mission handbook, but speaking from experience. Out here, the rules felt less like guidelines and more like survival instincts. It was a Thursday evening, and we were driving back from Superior, the sun bleeding red into the horizon. Ramirez was at the wheel, humming a hymn under his breath while I stared out the window, watching the shadows grow long and sharp across the desert. We were supposed to be back before dark, but the appointment had run late. Now the road ahead was cloaked in twilight, and the silence between us felt heavier with each passing mile. I was about to say something, maybe crack a joke to lighten the mood, when Ramirez slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, and I lurched forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest. "What the hell?" I barked, clutching the dashboard. Ramirez didn't answer. He was staring at something in the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. I followed his gaze and froze. A dog, at least I think it was a dog, stood in the middle of the highway. Its fur was patchy, hanging in clumps like it had been pulled off in strips. Its ribs jutted out sharply, and its head hung low, almost too low, as if its neck couldn't support the weight. Its eyes, though, those weren't the eyes of an animal. They were dark and glassy, and they locked onto me like it knew I was watching. "Speed up," Ramirez said, his voice low and urgent. "What?" "Speed up," he snapped, slamming his foot on the gas. The engine roared and the truck lurched forward. I stared at him in disbelief. "You're gonna hit it." "Shut up," he hissed. "Don't look at it. Just don't look." But I did. I couldn't help it. As we barreled toward the thing, I turned to look, and for a split second, it looked back. The face staring at me wasn't a dog's. It wasn't even human. The skin was stretched too tight, the features twisted into something grotesque, like it was wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. And it smiled. Its lips pulled back to reveal jagged yellow teeth. And I swear I heard it laugh. A low, guttural sound that cut through the roar of the engine. I snapped my head forward, my heart hammering. The truck jolted as we sped past, and when I looked in the side mirror, the thing was gone. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Ramirez didn't answer. He was breathing hard, his eyes fixed on the road. "Don't talk about it," he finally said. "Don't even think about it." That night, back at the apartment, I couldn't shake the image. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring at me, its dark eyes boring into mine. Ramirez barely said a word as we ate dinner, and when the sun dipped below the horizon, he locked every door and window in the place. It seemed excessive, but I didn't argue, not after what I'd seen. It was around 11 p.m. when the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a faint tap 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 on the front door. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Ramirez's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Don't answer it," he whispered. "What if it's the district leader?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. My skin prickled. I moved toward the door, but Ramirez grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't." I shrugged him off. "You're being ridiculous. It's probably just..." He cut me off with a desperate look. "If you open that door, we're dead." Something in his tone stopped me cold. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever was on the other side knew we were listening. And then I heard it. "Elder," a voice called softly. It sounded like our district leader, but something about it was wrong. The tone was off, too flat, like it was reading from a script. "Elder Ramirez? Elder Johnson? It's me. Open the door." My blood ran cold. Ramirez pulled out his phone and dialed, his hands shaking. After a few tense seconds, someone picked up. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In bed," came the groggy reply. "Why?" "Send me a picture," Ramirez demanded. "Now." I heard the muffled sound of confusion on the other end, followed by the ding of a text. Ramirez showed me the screen, a photo of our district leader and his companion, timestamped just a minute earlier. They were in their apartment, 2 hours away. The knocking stopped. I let out a shaky breath, but Ramirez's grip on my arm tightened. "It's not over," he whispered. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It pressed against my ears, thick and unnatural. And then, faintly, I heard it. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, just outside the window. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The blinds rattled softly, as if something was brushing against them. Ramirez motioned for me to stay put as he moved toward the window. He peeked through the edge of the blinds and went rigid. His face drained of color, and he stumbled back, his hand clutching the cross around his neck. "What did you see?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He just turned to me with a look I'll never forget, pure, unfiltered terror. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, backs against the wall, clutching whatever we could find that felt even remotely like a weapon. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside. And when the sun finally rose, we found the footprints. Large, clawed, and muddy. They led from the front door to the window, then stopped abruptly. As if whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. But I knew it hadn't. Not really. We didn't talk about what happened that night, not at first. Ramirez wouldn't look me in the eye, and I wasn't about to press him. I wasn't even sure I wanted answers. Every instinct I had screamed to forget it, pretend none of it had happened. But how do you ignore muddy claw marks that disappear into nowhere? The next morning, our district meeting was already set. We drove in silence, the truck humming along the cracked highway. The desert felt different now. The vast emptiness I'd once found almost peaceful had turned oppressive, as if every shadow and rock was hiding something. Ramirez gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles bone white, while I kept my eyes on the horizon, avoiding my own reflection in the passenger side mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling something was watching us, just out of sight. The meeting started like any other. Elders talking shop, exchanging stories about rejections, and the occasional rare success. But when it came to my turn to share, I hesitated. The words were caught in my throat like barbed wire. Ramirez stayed silent, but I could feel his eyes on me, daring me to say something. Finally, I muttered, "We had some disturbances, knocking, weird noises." The room went quiet. Too quiet. Everyone else exchanged uneasy glances, and the air grew heavy, almost stifling. Elder Hutchins, one of the district leaders, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Disturbances?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with something sharp. "What kind of disturbances?" I swallowed hard and tried to keep my tone light. "You know, just strange knocking. A voice outside the door. Probably just some kids messing with us." Hutchins didn't laugh. His face darkened, and he exchanged a look with his companion before nodding slowly. "You saw something, didn't you?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. I hesitated, but Ramirez stepped in. "We don't need to get into it," he said quickly. "It's handled." "No, it's not," Hutchins snapped, his composure slipping for a moment. "You think this is a joke? You think this is something you can just ignore?" The tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, Hutchins leaned back and sighed. "You've heard of skinwalkers, right?" What followed was a crash course in nightmares. Hutchins explained the legend in hushed tones, his voice steady but his hands trembling. Skinwalkers, he said, were dark spirits, shapeshifters born of unspeakable acts. Murder, betrayal. They wore the skins of animals, mimicked human voices, and thrived on fear. According to local lore, making eye contact or acknowledging them gave them power over you, marked you in some way. "They don't stop," Hutchins said, his eyes fixed on me. "Once they notice you, they keep coming, unless you figure out how to break their hold." My stomach churned. The thing on the road, the knocking, the voice outside our door. Had I looked too long? Listened too closely? I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come. That night I was restless. Ramirez tried to reassure me, mumbling prayers under his breath, as he sprinkled the apartment with salt and holy water. It seemed desperate, almost futile, but I didn't stop him. Any comfort, no matter how small, was better than none. Around midnight, the air in the apartment changed. It felt heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Ramirez and I exchanged a look, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a faint tap tap tap, but it grew louder, sharper, until the entire doorframe rattled. This time, there was no mistaking the malice behind it. The sound was angry, purposeful, like whatever was out there was trying to break through. Ramirez grabbed a Bible and stood near the door, muttering rapid prayers. I stayed back, clutching the pocket knife I'd brought from California. It felt laughably inadequate, but it was all I had. The knocking stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then came the voice. "Elder Ramirez, Elder Johnson, let me in." It sounded like Hutchins. Perfectly, unmistakably Hutchins. But it wasn't him. The voice was wrong. Flat. Hollow. Like it was coming from a broken speaker. Ramirez shook his head, his lips moving silently in prayer. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate strokes, like claws dragging across wood. The sound was unbearable, setting my teeth on edge. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, waiting for it to give way. But it didn't. Somehow it held. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then I felt it. A cold hand brushed against the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just Ramirez, wide-eyed and pale, clutching his cross like a lifeline. The next morning, the claw marks were there, deep gouges in the wood, too precise and on purpose to be anything natural. We reported it to the mission office, but they dismissed it as a prank. We knew better. Whatever it was, it wasn't done with us. Driving to our next assignment, The unease followed me like a shadow. I caught glimpses of something in the mirrors, a figure, distorted and animalistic, always just out of focus. I didn't tell Ramirez. I couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had marked me back on that highway wasn't going to let go. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope tonight's stories kept you company in the dark. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe. Good night, and see you in the next one.